Chapter 34. As usual, Angharad Tredegar being decent proved to be very inconvenient. Instead of the hour or so Tristan had planned on waiting until the crew began crossing the shattered hall, he had to wait more than the double. Though he never came close enough to see more than their silhouettes in the distance, too much of a risk. With Songren around, he caught a glimpse of them leaving and let out a breath of relief. Finally. The thief had learned patience but never learned to love it. Once they were out of sight, Tristan set about his work, finding Augusto Cerdon's passage back to the old fort. Listening to the man's blathering had yielded a vague idea of where it should be located. Though the Infanzon had been careful not to mention where the crevice he had fallen in actually was, he had been all too eager to boast about how quickly he had made his way through the mirror maze itself. Tristan had memorized the directions he had allegedly gone in, significantly narrowing down the locations where the crevice could be. It had been the part of the Infanzon's words he truly narrowed in on, only lending half an ear to the rest. The thief's fingers clenched. If he had listened to the rest more carefully, heard the hints, then maybe. Glaring at that slab of crystal won't move it, Fortuna advised him. Well, certainly not now that she was sitting on it. You know I'm going to be climbing that, he said. Instead of getting out of the way as was the implied request, the goddess stretched like a cat and posed. I thought you'd be happier after getting to Papa Cerdon, Fortuna said. Is Vanessa's last hurrah still spoiling the taste? Tristan's face went blank. There were hints, in retrospective, he evenly said. Abuela was right, I let my guard down and immediately things began to slip my notice. Fortuna snorted. Yeah, because that's what you're torn about, the golden-eyed goddess mocked. Sure. You're a tough old rat, much too tough to be sad about the nice old lady that you liked offing herself. He gritted his teeth. Taunt all you like, he said, you can't deny that, she was already dead, Tristan, Fortuna cut through. She wasn't going to get that leg amputated no matter what you said. She just couldn't see a life worth living with one leg. Quicksilver anger rose, swift and blinding. You think I don't know what? He snarled. One eye, one leg, she would lose her shop even if she went back. He passed a hand through his hair, anger still clenching his jaw tight. She had to know I'd give her the poison if she asked, Fortuna, he said. That I wouldn't buck at getting rid of Ocotlan, that I'd dose it right so he died out in the maze instead of at the fucking kitchen table with everyone watching. She did it this way because she wanted to be caught. A part of that, he figured, must be so the blame couldn't fall on him if it came out the poisons were his. But the greater part had been that Vanessa simply did not want to live past that morning. She had not wanted imprisonment or pain, so she had drunk the poppy and confessed to a man bearing a pistol and the duty to use it. He cursed and felt like kicking the slab of crystal even though it would do nothing but bruise his toes. There was no place in that decision for you to stick your nose in, Fortuna said. She picked her dice and rolled them. What came after that was between her and the table. I am not so much of a hypocrite as to deny someone the settling of their dues, Tristan tersely said. But she was worth more than an Ocotlan. You could find the likes of the bruiser at any tavern of the Merc. Strength paired with cruelty was a coin no city ever grew poor with. Kindness, offered unstintingly to strangers? That was a rare good. It wasn't an even trade, that's all, he murmured. Sometimes you just have to take the loss, Fortuna replied, not unsympathetically. But not, he thought, with sympathy either. She was a goddess, the lady of long odds. Fortuna would never be able to see the world through anything but those lenses, and it was not in her nature to truly mourn a loss. How could she, when the bone of her was to roll the dice until that 1 in 1,000 victory came roaring into life? Losing taste for the conversation, Tristan opened his bag and put on the leather gloves. He had work to do and he was already behind on the timetable. It took a little under an hour to find Augusto Cerdon's saving grace. The search grew easier once Tristan was certain the man had lied, which given that he was dealing with an Infanzon he had assumed was the case anyhow. His lordship had not gotten anywhere as far in the mirror hall as he had claimed. As the outskirts of the shattered grounds were the easiest to get around in, this proved to be a stroke of luck. The crevice in question was long and thin, like a slicing wound in the earth, and half covered by a crumpled wall. The wall had broken into pieces when a chunk of ceiling fell onto it, which made reaching a part of the crevice broad enough to pass through simple, if exhausting, work. Tristan dragged away sharp chunks of crystal, glad for the thickness of the leather gloves, until there was room enough to see into the depths. Which were, he was somewhat amused to see, not all that deep. Lantern light revealed the fall was only 7 feet or so. It also confirmed he had the right place. He spied a stray brass button that had not a speck of dust on it, unlike the rest of the floor. Someone had recently gone through here. Tristan lowered himself down and pocketed the button. That made 3, added to the stone pair from the pillar he'd split between his pocket and his boot, before tugging the rope down after him. The space down here was a narrow crypt whose ceiling was so low he had to stay on his knees, empty tombs flanking him from both sides. After maybe 30 feet of cramped crawling, the crypt ended and there was drop into a much larger room. Larger and rather unusual, there was nothing in there save for a bridge over dark, oily waters. The floor was paved, faded gray and yellow tiles with geometric shapes within. On the opposite side of the bridge was a closed door of a metal so worn the thief could not tell what it was. Tristan did not have to be told to know a god dwelt here. This must be the seat of the test Augusto Cerdan claimed to have beaten. Shimmying out of the crypt, Tristan dropped onto the tiled floor and took a moment to catch his bearings. Dusting off his shoulders the thief rose, lantern high, and cleared his throat. So how might one go about earning the right to cross the bridge? Tristan called out. Movement caught his eye. It looked like a stray dog, the same faded gray as the tiles, its eyes and teeth the same yellow, but he knew better than to believe what he saw. The god might be pretending it had been nestled against the back wall on the other side of the bridge, just now rising, but the thief would not have missed it were it truly there. The stray dog, stray god, trotted to the middle of the bridge before stopping. It lay down there, almost lazily. Supplicant, the god greeted him. Its voice, he thought, sounded like a brush against a tile. Like someone painting. God of the land, he replied, bowing his head. You may take my test to earn passage, the dog told him, or you may pay the toll and cross. He cocked his head to the side. Your test being? There are 6 circles hidden among the tiles, the god said. Find them and you may pass through here as you will. That, he thought, sounded like one of those tests that would be much harder than they seemed. And the toll. The dog opened its maw happily, the teeth, yellow but in a way that defied the description of dirty, too uniform in color and perfectly formed, it showed licked by a gray tongue. I need paint, the god. Fresh paint. The colors fade. Tristan was not a fool. You want my blood, he stated. 3 drops, the dog god said. You smell of an interesting life. Your hue will not soon fade. The thief swallowed. The man who came here before me, Tristan said. He paid the toll, didn't he? The dog nodded. The thief mentally tipped his hat to Augusto Cerdan. He had, in truth, been more inclined to believe the Infanzon a victor than not. It ought to be amusing to find out how long he'd kept up the lie around the maze crew. It was shallow paint, the god said. Too much of the same, easily yellowed. Yours will be a gray, I think. That always takes time. Giving a god blood was not as dangerous as the faint-hearted assumed. Tristan had done so infrequently to the Rat King when offering prayer and twice to the capricious Bones when he'd had to swim near the bottom of the canals in the old town. The main was a vicious thing and not above snatching those that dwelt near the depths it claimed as its domain. Besides, Augusto Cerdan had not visibly taken ill from paying the toll. Tristan, however, knew things about this maze that the Infanzon did not. Is it him? He asked. It was not the stray dog he was addressing. Fortuna stepped past him, fanning herself as she glared at the god on the bridge. It is utterly deplorable manners, she sneered, to defile a remnant in this way. A god of your age should know better. The dog lazily turned to look at her. Directly at her, Tristan saw. As if it could see her standing there. And then it changed. Its skin bubbled and melted, peeling away in chunks. THD herd warped, gray and yellow bending and blurring until a wet redness squelched out, coming back together into a shape that was like a hound's herd traced in tendrils of red, grinning wetly. The sight had him shivering in disgust, the inherent wrongness of what he beheld repellent beyond what words could express. "A stray thing that does not know when to die," the red ma said, and laughed. Tristan's limbs were shaking. He almost fell to his knees. That voice, that. No, it hadn't been a voice. It had been like a mouth against his ear, sucking out the wetness inside his skull and feeding upon it. He could feel it still, as a silent disease lingering inside his brains. The thief convulsed, but it was not his stomach that wanted to throw up, it was his soul. "You have decayed," Fortuna said, and her voice was fresh water at the height of summer. Tristan, only now realizing he was on his knees, let out a gasp. He had been drowning on air and never even known. "There is a sickness in you, as if your very root grew out crooked," the Lady of Long Odds mused. "Whatever is it you are a god of now, it is not what you were born for." "The masters are gone," the red ma grinned. "I can eat my fill." A hand caught Tristan's wrist. He blinked in surprise, watching his own curled fingers as Fortuna looked down at him worriedly. He had been about to claw at the side of his head, he realized. To dig and dig through the flesh, until he could rip out the poisonous warmness slithering in through his ear holes like an unguarded gate. "Focus," she told him. "Think of a coin spinning." Mouth dry, gums bleeding against his ragged tongue, Tristan forced himself to see it. To hear it, feel it. The ring of gold as it spun, the glint in the light. The satisfying snap as his thumb sent it spinning. The flat sensation as it landed on his palm. He could feel himself breathe, his heart beat fearful and steady. "Dashwork will not hold me," the red ma said. "The light-bringers bastards broke the work, but they cannot rule it. The seal will fail. I will grow and take, ta-ke-ta-ke-ta-ke-ta." The pressure built against his eardrums like he was at the bottom of the sea, drowning, and as he vainly covered his ears Tristan screamed. Screamed until his throat was raw and his lungs burning, his lips cracked. He came to on his knees, weeping as his feverish forehead rested on the cool tile beneath. Fortuna was stroking his back, whispering soothingly. "It's all right," the goddess said. "He's gone now, Tristan. He left." Tristan croaked out, tasting copper on his cracked lips. Gods. He felt like a child again, a wail welling up inside his throat in the face of the unfairness of the world. "What did he do?" Tristan asked. "He looked at you," Fortuna quietly said. "All of him, just for a moment. But you didn't crack, Tristan. Your mind held." The thief blubbered out something that was both relief and terror. Had he truly held? He could not tell. Could not be sure what he had been like, before that awful sound. It felt like he was stained from the inside, like there was rot he would never be rid of. "He's gone now?" he asked. Begged. "When he turned his eye on you, the gods of the maze bit at him," Fortuna said. "Now he must bite them back. His gaze won't return here for some time." Tristan forced himself to his feet. The lantern had tipped over, some oil spilling out, but he did not even try to clean it and harshly yanked it upright. He fled across the bridge, into the deep halls, and kept fleeing all the way back to the old fort. It was as if he'd been in a trance. Tristan, for the life of him, could not have described the path he took to return. It was a blur, a vague sense of movement and stumbling forward. It only began to swim back into focus when he was past the shrines, on the open grounds leading to the ramparts. The steadiness of his boots against the stone helped, but the thief felt tired to his very bone. As if life had been wrung out of him. The dull ache pounding away at his skull did not help any. By the time he reached the hole in the ramparts he felt halfway like a person again, but patting away at his hair and straightening his clothes had not been enough. The watchmen on guard both raised their musket at him. "Don't move," the sergeant ordered. "Hands away from your weapons." He flicked a glance at the Aslan watchwoman by his side. "Get Bassett. He looks like a breach." The young woman saluted, throwing him a pitying glance before she left. Tristan had to blink away sleep twice, But even though he was swaying on his feet, the watchman's gun never went down. The Aslan came back with a young Milani watchman, who was half-dressed and still blinking sleep out of his eyes. He yawned. "This the one? Do you see anyone else?" the sergeant flatly asked. The Milani, Bassett, a strange name, rolled his eyes but took a step closer. Tristan eyed him warily, especially when the other man began sniffing at him. "Still only one contract," Bassett said. "Could have had a brush, but the scent of his spirit is so strong I can't tell." "A breach," the sergeant had said. "They were looking to see if the red moss sunk its hooks in me." How tired was he, for the realization to have taken so long? The sergeant grunted, but after a heartbeat finally lowered his musket. "You can come in," he said. "Watch your step, rat. No one's in a trifling mood after the debacle earlier." Tristan slowly nodded, pinching the inside of his own wrist when no one was looking. The pain woke him some, though it would not last long. A debacle. Something to look into when he was more awake. It was hard to tell the time, but by the looks of most lights being out it must have been night. Though more than ready to drop on his bedroll and tumble headlong into sleep, Tristan did not get the chance. One of the curtains further down was moved aside as he approached, Mariam's head popping out. Blue eyes widened when she saw him. Swallowing a groan, Tristan obeyed when she gestured for him to come. The curtain fell behind him and they could hardly see each other, but that did not stop her from inspecting him. "You look half dead," she bluntly said. "What happened to you?" "The way back was more unpleasant than advertised," Tristan said. "I'm dead tired, a report will have to wait." "What's this I hear about a debacle?" Mariam grimaced. "Lieutenant Vicente rustled up a crew and went past the locked door," she said. 20 went in, armed to the teeth. 9 came back. They drove the god away, wounded it, but they could not score a kill. That, the thief thought, was going to be trouble. What were they trying to do? Mariam leaned closer. "Looking for the brand you gave Franco," she whispered. "They went where you said and did not find it, so Vicente flew into a rage. Had all our rooms searched while we were put under arrest." He closed his eyes. Tristan could almost feel a second, larger headache looming behind his current one. That assault had been reckless of the lieutenant. Why had she made her attempt now, when instead she could have reached out to her superiors to gather support? He asked Mariam, but she had no more idea than he and other news just as pressing besides. "The brand works," Mariam told him. "We smuggled it into the room, the one with the engine they've had us studying, and it reacted. We shut the device down before the guard could notice, but I bargained with Lieutenant Wen, and in 3 hours we are going back. Sergeant Mendiza will have the watch shift. She is to cover for us." Tristan almost wept. Only 3 hours? He needed 3 days, not this pittance. But he could not afford to miss Franco's discoveries. "I'll be there," he sighed. Every ounce of his flesh felt exhausted and there was still one thing he needed to do before he could sleep. "I'm going to need your help," he said. "I hit a rusty piece of metal earlier. I need to clean the wound or I'm risking lockjaw." "That's going to sting," Mariam said. He grimly nodded. They'd have to open it anew and clean it with alcohol to be sure nothing caught. A fitting end to a bloody day. It was Yang who kicked him awake. "Up," the Tianxi whispered. "We need to move before Vicente's people are back on watch." "Lovely to see you too," Tristan muttered back. He checked on his bandages before leaving, finding Mariam's work was still held, and hastily put on his boots before following Yang. They were to be the last one in, the older man told him. Franco and Mariam were already inside. They hurried to the bastion, the blast cloaks on the walls hardly sparing them a glance, then up the ladder. A few flights of stairs later they were in the room with the etheric machine and the stripes of cryptoglyphs on the walls. Sergeant Mendiza, Wen's tall right hand with the easy smile and the utter lack of mercy behind it, was idling at the door. Mendiza was, Tristan had cottoned on early, one of the most dangerous people in the old fort. She talked about death like someone who thought little of dealing it out. "Ah, Tristan," Franco toothlessly smiled. "I am glad to see you've returned safely to us." "It was a journey," the thief mildly said. "What have you got for us?" Franco. I'm curious about that myself, Sergeant Mendisa noted. I thought brands had very specific and narrow uses. It makes more sense for it to be paired with a device on the other side of the pillar. They do, Mariam agreed. But we can get what we need without having full run of the device. The man-sized machine had not changed since last saw it, the golden ally box at the top sprouting spindly levers while beneath it 12 cylinders interlocked with pistons led down into a sideways barrel with a lid of green glass. It was against that dull lid that Franco pressed the brand, and as the old man smiled excitedly, light began to spread through the glass. A green glow gently pulsed in everyone's breath caught, the old wonder had come alive. The machine is not truly functional at the moment, Franco noted. As you theorized, Sergeant Mendisa, this brand is not the right key to make it work. Thankfully for us, it appears to be resonating with a component in the barrel and the reactions buys us some measure of power. And what, Young said, is that power to be used for? My study of cryptoglyphs is relatively shallow, I warn you, the old professor said. But I am fairly certain that I have identified a combination of levers that causes either audit or inspect. We tried it earlier but I cannot make the corresponding signs, so there was no reaction, Mariam said. It might work now, though. Exciting, Sergeant Mendisa enthused. Go on. Franco glanced at Mariam, who shrugged. The sequence did not seem all that complicated to Tristan's eye, 2 levers pulled down, 1 pulled to the side. Exactly in that order. To everyone's disappointment, nothing happened. Until the green glow winked out. The machine shuddered, the gears under the golden frame grinding as the pistons interlocked with the cylinders began to move. Something flickered behind the green glass, but the light did not return. Not there, anyway, till their shared surprise colors bloomed on the wall facing the barrel's lid. Sergeant Mendisa, who was in the way, was painted with them for a heartbeat before she moved away. Unharmed, to all their reliefs. I'll be damned, Young said. It actually worked. It had, Tristan said. Now if he only had an idea what they were looking at. It was, he thought, an eye-searing tableau of green and red. 2 wobbly green shapes, one broadly an oval and the other a misshapen triangle, were filled with red tendrils that breached the edge of the shape. They waited a moment longer but nothing changed. The colors on the wall remained, occasionally sputtering dark for a second before resuming. The thief got the sense that they might be running on borrowed time. They all looked rather bemused, save for Mariam. Her eyes were on the green shape to the right, unblinking. Sorry. He prompted. That, she said, pointing where she had been looking, is a map of the Dominion of Lost Things. As seen from a bird's-eye view. Doubting her would be foolish when she had used a sign to commit a map of the Dominion perfectly to her memory. Tristan paused, glancing at the other shape. A badly drawn triangle, he thought, unless. So this one is the island from the side, he said. As if looking through it. Sergeant Mendisa went still. It stood out all the more for her usual liveliness. So you know the Red Maw exists, Tristan thought. She was highly ranked enough for that. What is the red, then? Young frowned. Tristan had not kept complete silence over the Red Maw's existence after finding out its existence with Franco, but he had only broken up for Sare. The Tianxi veteran was still in the dark. He is the only one that doesn't know, now that Vanessa is dead. Perhaps the time for secrecy was past. A god, Tristan said. One the watch is keeping contained. Failing to, Sergeant Mendisa mildly said. None of you are fools, so I expect that I don't have to tell you flapping your lips will get you killed. The threat was so matter-of-fact it was difficult to take offense to it. Besides, Tristan was more interested by her first words, she had noticed as well, then. Near the back of the island, the opposite end of the island from where the Bluebell had docked, tendrils of red were breaking past the green shape representing the island. Seen from the side they curled deep below before going forward, which Tristan figured to mean that the Red Maw had begun to burrow its tendrils in the bedrock under the Tribbean Sea so it could spread to other isles. Fascinating, Franco muttered. The old man was standing close to the colors on the wall, eyes shining with interest. What is? Young asked. "Look at the pattern in the red here," the old man said, pointing to the bird's eye view. Fingers traced along red furrows, the thickest of the red lines. "See how they make up a geometric shape?" he asked. The professor was right. Centered around the mountain they currently stood under there was a perfect hexagon of red. "And from the tip of each emanates a slightly smaller line," Francho continued. "That is not a natural occurrence. Not how no other red tendril gets as large as these, even when they branch out from these artificial furrows." Sergeant Mendis's jaw clenched. "What are we looking at, Professor?" she asked. "Antediluvian work," he said. "I would bet my life on it." The red maw's heart was under this pillar, Tristan knew. And now it turned out the pillar was at the center of some sort of titanic antediluvian work, one of which the golden etheric machine above was likely a single component instead of the culmination. The view of the island from the side only added more questions. The hexagon line were deep below the surface of the island. It was the lines emitting from the points of the geometric shape that went up towards the ground, and even then only tendrils reached close to the surface. What did it mean? His eyes returned to the bird's eye view, and looking at the broader hexagon lines he tried to think of all the maps he had seen before. Mostly of Sacromonte, admittedly, and... "Oh. They are canals," Tristan suddenly said. "The big channels, they are canals to carry something around. The god fucking everything up is supposed to be the water, the means of transportation somehow." His memories of the confrontation by the bridge were hazy, like the edges of it had been exposed to an open flame and curled in on themselves, but he remembered what Fortuna had said, whatever it was that the red maw was once meant to be, it had deviated from that route. The corruption is about the way it feeds, Tristan thought. It's eating more than it should and it's making it crooked somehow. Only the thief could not see how it would. All gods fed with ceaseless hunger. Even those who grew strong enough to manifest did not set aside that all-consuming desire. So how could the red maw feeding be a deviation? That explains why the smaller red roads look so small and shoddy, then, Young noted. They were built by the god, not by the ancients. Tristan breathed in. It takes to grow, he thought. The red maw did. But what if it isn't supposed to grow? What if the god the antediluvians had trapped beneath their great machinery was meant to stick to the canals they had built and never spread beyond? That's how it serves as water, it eats on one end and spits out on the other, moving life or ether or whatever the antediluvians wanted moved. Only when the old night fell the red maw had stopped spitting out what it ate. Now it was using that power to grow instead, to spread. Lieutenant Wen needs to be made aware of this, Mandisa said. We're done here. What will he do? Tristan asked. He forced nonchalance. His bargain with Wen rested on the foundation that he would break the golden machine above, so if the fat Tianxi decided that the situation was too dire to risk ending the lights he was in trouble. The tall sergeant hesitated. Keep to your bargain, the dark-skinned woman finally said. Prepare for tomorrow as planned. Tristan slowly nodded, wondering how much he could trust the pair. Shallowly at best, he thought. He had told Mariam of his deal with Lieutenant Wen, but not the other two. When Mendisa's loose tongue outed it earned him pointed looks. He would have to give explanations, the thief thought. But not here or now. As Mendisa had said, they were done here. Francho took the brand away from the machine and the colors went out, the green glow returning to the lid for a few seconds before fading. Tristan's eyes lingered on the brand. Now that he was slightly more rested, he could think of one reason why Lieutenant Vicente would have pushed for an assault past the locked gate. Sergeant, he said, catching the woman's gaze. I need a favor. It was small enough she accepted. They snuck back to their rooms after that, and Tristan was all too happy to rest a little more. He closed his eyes and was asleep moments later, only to be kicked away after what must have been hours but felt like mere minutes. Young, he groaned. Do you need to drag him out? It was not Young but two large watchmen grabbing him as the coldly furious voice had ordered. Tristan did not resist, going immediately limp. He would not win the fight and would rather face what would be coming without bruises. Fear killed every last drag of sleep as the blast cloaks forced him to his feet and twisted his arms behind his back before pushing him forward. He stumbled, bare feet on the cold stone, and found he was being waited on. Arrayed in the courtyard were more than 24 watchmen, what had to be most of the remaining garrison, and none of them said a word as he was dragged to stand before them. He quickly found who he was looking for. Lieutenant Wen was seated at a kitchen table, biting into some kind P34-8 pastry with Sergeant Mandissa standing by his side, but Tristan did not let his gaze linger. Even if it turned out they were allies, they would not show it now. Not when the source of the voice that had ordered him dragged was glaring down at him. Lieutenant Vicente did not look wounded, for all that she had been part of the ill-fated assault on the pillar, but she did look haggard. Her hair was in disarray, her eyes a little wild. Her anger might be cold, but it was the kind of cold that had something ugly lurking under it. The worst kind, Tristan thought. The two big blast cloaks holding him in place kept flanking him as the lieutenant scowled. "You lied to me," Lieutenant Vicente said. "In your report. We reached the location you described and the brand was not there." A rumble of anger from the crowd. How many blast cloaks had there been in the garrison this morning? 30, 40? If 11 had died, then everyone here had lost at least a friend. Likely more. He would get no mercy from this tribunal if things went badly for him. "I also told you that the god was able to enter the room leading there," the thief pointed out. "It nearly killed me in it. I made no promises that everything would still be the same." A loud scoff. "Sergeant Olivia," he saw. Her smile was smugly unpleasant. "And we are to believe the god left them untouched for centuries and then suddenly changed its mind?" "I don't care what you believe, Olivia," he frankly replied. "I care that I have been dragged to stand before what looks like a hanging crowd on the basis of, I can't tell, really, being disliked by 2 watch officers." He paused. "I have heard accusations but no proof," Tristan said. "Yet I am a prisoner. Is this how the watch handles its affairs?" That, he saw, struck the mark. Uneasy faces. Lieutenant Wen raised an eyebrow at Vicente. Still allies, then, Tristan thought. Wen yet had a use for him, so he should be willing to put a thumb to the scales to keep the thief alive if he could. "You are not imprisoned," Lieutenant Vicente bit out. The thief smiled pleasantly, turning his pearly teeth to the big blast cloaks holding him. "Did you hear that, my lads?" he said. "I am not imprisoned." He tugged at their arms meaningfully and after they glanced at Vicente, who snarled out a nod, they released him. They even took a few steps back. Ah, good. Now he might feasibly make a run for it, though fleeing a garrison armed with muskets when he did not even have boots on seemed. Well, he had marked that plan down as suicide with a flourish. You had to start somewhere. And now to account for the piece he'd not got eyes on, where were the others? A glance flicked backwards showed him that armed watchmen were standing in front of the other occupied rooms. When Young opened his curtain a musket was pointed at him and a harsh order had the Tianxi closing it. There would be no help from there. Worse, there was another blast cloak going through his affairs and she came out with a noise of triumph. The watchman was, he saw, holding a button in her hand. A stone button, one of those that could serve as a key to the locked door in the pillar. Probably the one in my coat, he decided. The one in his boot was well hidden. "Found it, ma'am," she called out. "He has a key, like you said." "And there we are," Lieutenant Vicente smilingly said. "Evidence, as you requested. You had a way to get in there and take the brand." Tristan smiled pleasantly back, then looked at the watchwoman. "You, going through my things," he called out. "What's your name?" The blast cloaks blinked at him in surprise. She said. "Dulce?" "Dulce," he repeated. "While you're still in there, do you happen to see the brand?" A moment of silence. "No," Dulce conceded. Tristan turned his gaze back to Lieutenant Vicente. "Fancy that," he said. She snorted. "So you hid it somewhere else," Vicente said. "I could have done that, yes," Tristan easily said. "I could also be the king of Eastley. Are we dragging people out of their beds in the middle of the night for colds now, Lieutenant?" Wen bit into his pastry, which was more than halfway finished, and loudly swallowed. There were flakes all over his chin. "He's not wrong," the Tianxi lieutenant said. "You have a key too, Vasanti. How close of an eye did you keep on it?" The old woman turned on the other officer, face twisted with anger. "Are you implying one of us did this?" "I am stating that anyone could have used your key, or his for that matter," Lieutenant Wen evenly replied. "You want us to execute a trial taker on grounds this thin? We'll all answer to Commander Ardle for it." He paused. "Unless you're asking for us to send falsified reports about the whole business," Wen said. "Is that the case?" "Of course not," Vasanti said. "A little too quickly." "Then make a better case," the Tianxi advised. "I'm not getting another black mark on my record just because you want to pin the blame for today's fuck-up on some Sacramonte rat." That had hard eyes turned on her, but it did not last. 11 of us died, Wen, Lieutenant Vasanti said. "Now you want to let the only person with answers walk away?" The mood, which had been going Wen's way, turned sharply back her way. Vasanti wasn't leaning on reason, Tristan thought. She was using anger, and anger always got a bite. Most of the people here must already have black marks on their record to have gotten this assignment in the first place, he thought. It's not as strong a deterrent for them. "Don't go putting words in my mouth," Wen dismissed. "You want answers? By all means, get them. But this play-acting is wasting everyone's time. By morning either we'll have a legitimate reason to put a bullet in his skull or we'll have to let him take the trial." A pause. "So are you going to drag him in a corner for a real interrogation," the Tianxi said, "or are you going to keep pissing away my good night's sleep pretending you some kind of magistrate?" Lieutenant Vasanti glared at the other officer, but she saw the same thing Tristan did. Wen had convinced them. The watch was not a mob or a coterie, it had rules, and Vasanti had not given them good enough a reason to break them, not when there was a way to get answers that wouldn't get their superiors coming down on their heads. This was, Tristan thought, the best Wen could do for him. Getting him out was simply not in the cards, not with this many angry souls out for a scapegoat. So what the Tianxi could offer was to get him away from the mob. To put him in a room with only a few, where he could wheel and deal behind closed doors. A swell of gratitude, barely marred by the fact that Wen had essentially just suggested he be tortured for answers. "Fine," the old Someshwari hissed. "If you don't care enough to get answers for the dead, I will." "Oh, Vasanti," Lieutenant Wen mildly said, "I do care. Unlike you, I knew their names. It's why when Commander Ardle has you shot for getting more of us killed against his explicit orders, I'll be sitting in that room with another of these pastries." The fat Tianxi smiled, swallowing the last piece and licking his fingers. "And I'm sure it will taste delicious." Tristan never met his eyes, did not even look at him, but in his mind's eye he thanked Wen for this last gift. He'd just been told something that might save his life. The fist dug deep in his belly and Tristan folded, throwing up all over the floor. It was not the worst beating he'd ever had. The watchmen were professional about it, hitting places where the damage would not be permanent and measuring their strength carefully. He would hurt, he would bruise, but there would be no broken bones or hidden bleeding. "Back in the chair," Lieutenant Vasanti ordered. They forced him back up even as his stomach trembled and bile rose. "A little to the left," Fortuna whispered into his ear. He followed her suggestion when he threw up again, drenching the legs of the watchman most satisfyingly. The man cursed and shoved him into the chair, backing away. The other one laughed, pulling up Tristan's chin so he was facing Lieutenant Vasanti. The old Someshwari's gaze was cold, unmoved by the sight of the violence she had ordered. "Where is the brand, Tristan?" she asked. "Are you familiar with the poetess Illyria's works?" the rat asked. Again, Vasanti said. The Blascloak who'd pulled his chin up slapped him, open-palmed. His cheeks were so red by now he barely felt it. They would rotate back to his inner thighs soon. "Where is the brand, Tristan?" Lieutenant Vasanti asked. "There's this poem in her little eyes," he said. "The Court of Cats." The Someshwari sighed. "Choke him." The big man seized him by the throat, toppling the chair, and he smacked against the wall. Fingers like sausages squeezed as he tried to breathe. Tristan went into himself, eyes on seeing. He thought of the grave he was in, the shape of it. The feel of the stone under his fingers, the coolness. How his feet pushed against the bottom, how he would have to fold his legs to get out. Enough, he'll die. Tristan gasped, air flooding back into his lungs, and began to cough. The blast cloak he thrown up on looked at him carefully, then drew back. He's fine. Lieutenant Vicente leaned forward. Where is the brand, Tristan? So the second verse, he rasped. It goes like this. The fingers went back around his throat, not even needing an order. To leave the court of cats is even simpler done. He got out before the squeeze. He gasped blindly, trying to breathe through the grip. Stop, Vicente said. Let him finish. He croaked out a broken laugh when the fingers released him. For when their hunger comes, rats are ever sport. A long moment of silence. Give me the rum, the lieutenant said. I know what will make him crack. Liar, Tristan thought, smiling a bloodied smile. The pair of toughs, for that was all they were, regardless of the color of their cloak, traded surprised glances but obeyed their superior. The door closed on the small dark room, the only lantern lit casting its flickering glare between the two of them. I catch your drift. You want assurances I won't kill you when I have the brand, Vicente said. Why should I even believe you know where it is? Because you want to, Tristan rasped. Getting your hands on it is the only way you're living through the month. The Someshwari's eyes narrowed. Ah, had she thought he wasn't listening? Vicente herself had told him she was no longer allowed to try the pillar, that the attempts on the cog room had gotten too many watchmen killed. And now she had another 11 corpses to answer for, going against explicit orders. She was going to get shot for that, as Wen had said. Unless she had something to show worth that many deaths. You really are a nasty little rat, aren't you? She said. Always scurrying around everyone's business. He snorted. Come on, he said. How many reasons are there for you to get reckless enough for an assault? You think you figured out the tile combination that will open the front gate. You need the brand because you think it's what will get the device working. The tile device in the room just past the one where he had found the brand, the one where the god had almost killed him. Vicente must have figured them out even though the matching tiles on the iron gates had no symbols on them. The old woman stared at him for a long time. I was right, she suddenly said. I can't let you into the watch. It's too late for you. Tristan blinked, for an instant lost. You think you're the only one Nere ever trained, boy? Vicente harshly said. You're the third I've met. And both were fucking monsters, just like their maker. The Someshwari leaned forward. I took it easy on you, tried to nudge you off the trials so you could return to your old life, but always you doubled down, she said. The disease is already in the bone. He closed his eyes. Anger had not come to him so far, not when he was in the grave and he had yet to buy his way out. Anger, fear, they did not help. But now it came anyway. It wasn't even about me. His eyes flashed. Everything, he said with excruciating calm, was part of your pissing match with someone not even on this fucking island. The old lieutenant sneered. You have no idea what they were past that now. I don't care, Tristan laughed. And I don't need to, Vicente, because you're going to give me what I want. Should I call the boys back in? She coldly said. It doesn't matter if you do, he said. Because at the end of the day, Vicente, you're a coward. You're afraid of Abuela, afraid of what you've done, but most important of all you're afraid to die, and I'm the only one who can tell her the thing you need to live is. And under the black cloak, under the years and the authority and all the arrogance of someone used to being on the right side of the gun, Tristan knew what he was looking at. Vicente was a rat. I have people searching, she said. Do you think stashing things in a ruined bastion or one of the holes outside will work? I can wait, Tristan replied. Longer than you, I reckon. Vicente got up, walked out. Moments later, the two thugs walked in. Tristan closed his eyes and thought of the grave. An hour later Lieutenant Vicente returned. She bought her way out of her grave, and with that same coin Tristan bought his way out of his. After Vicente declared him innocent of everything to the watch garrison, Raymond Chardon's evil deeds were revealed. He had stolen Tristan's key and hidden the brand, a location the thief obtained from the Infanzon before his death in the maze. He told the lieutenant where the brand was after, and she flew into another rage. After all, it was in the watch's own armory, just as he had asked Sergeant Mendisa. Tristan watched the relief on Lieutenant Vicente's face afterwards, how it stayed there, and wondered if she would figure it out before the end. Tomorrow, come morning, Vicente was going to get those iron gates open and then go through them with every blastcloak still loyal to her. Go plumbing the depths of the pillar for secrets and wonders that would be worth 11 corpses in the eyes of her superiors. That expedition should serve as a perfectly serviceable distraction for when Tristan pushed her right back into her grave. Chapter 35. No one died in the night. A relief, but it did little to lift the mood when they began gathering in the gate room half an hour before the gate forward opened. Angharad had not slept well, wrestling with what she had heard, trying to sort out the truth from the lies. Song had tried to approach her about it, but the Perduri put her off. Unfair as it was, she resented the Tianxi for forcing her hand about eavesdropping on Isabel and Ferranda. Her world had been simpler before that conversation. Now Angharad must weigh everything. Was she being unfairly generous, when she thought something good of Isabel Ruesta? Was a contact bending her mind? Or was she being unfair by picking at every thought this way when Ferranda Vilazar had brought nothing but accusations? A contract was difficult to prove, but it was just as difficult to disprove. What could Isabel do or say to put Ferranda's allegations to rest? Nothing. And some of Ferranda's other accusations had been dubious, the talk of plot and there being a false killer. Grief at the death of a lover, and to think Sonali had been that, Angharad would never have suspected, could darken one's mind. Ferranda might have been lashing out. Or am I looking at Isabel's chances through the kindest mirror? The thoughts circled like dogs chasing each other's tails. There was no clear liar here, no monster whose warped pale face could be revealed by ripping off a mask. Just as she had through the night, Angharad wrestled with her doubts and stared moodily ahead. She did not shun Isabel, but neither did she engage in conversation. She lengthened her stride to stay ahead and prevent it. It left her at Acanthifos' side on the way to the temple fortress, the blemished traitor needing only a single quelling look to stay silent the whole way. This time, when they went down the stairs, everyone kept a large distance from each other. The temple fortress redstone awaited them at the bottom of the cauldron again, wind whistling softly behind them as they passed the bronze gates still open wide. This time, when they passed through the eclectic hall of treasures and trinkets, Angharad hung back. She left the front to others, those yet to become victors. They could deal with the spirit themselves. You came back. The massive Peafowl leapt down from her dais, dead god jostling on her back, and with all the dignity of an excited child trotted towards them. Flicking her tail feathers happily, she swayed to the sides in celebration. I thought you died, the Mayura confided. Mortals are so fragile. Not yet, Lord Zenzel said, but then the day's just begun. Surely one of us will be up for it. Let us be optimists, Lady Ferranda mused. I'll not settle for Xicle alone. I choose to believe that, as a community, we can also get Lord Augusto killed. The pair, Angharad thought, truly had become thick as thieves. Part of her was glad for them, that their grifts need not be borne alone, but the part of her that must go beyond decency worried. If Lady Ferranda pressed her suspicions and tried to kill Isabel, would Zenzeldumo help her? Angharad did not know and hated that she even had to consider it. This trial of ruins, it was like a mire. The longer they stayed in the maze, the deeper they sunk into the mud of their own petty plots and hatreds. Sometimes she thought the spirits might not be the true peril of this maze. Watch your tongue, the Chardon snarled, else you. Cosmo Flora's hand on his shoulder silenced him. We must win tests to reach the toll road, the older man said. By the rules our host has laid down, 3 champions must still be beaten. Is there one among us that would step forward? Angharad scoffed, which drew more than a few eyes to her. An interesting question to ask, she said, when you are not a victor yourself, Cosma floor. Where has yesterday's boldness gone? Unfriendly looks, but most of them were not sent her way. To her dismay, she found support in an unexpected place. She has a point, Cosm, Tupac said, idly tapping his spear against his shoulder. Go on then, my bold man, take the vanguard. Are you and Augusto not entirely capable of protecting yourselves? Angry, worried looks from both men Tupac had named. Angerade's eyes narrowed. A split between them and Tupac, perhaps? It may be that with Cosm at his side, Augusto had decided he need no longer be the Eastcli's lickspittle. This is Tupac calling them to heel, then, she thought. Uncertain as to whether she should allow it to happen, Angerade hesitated until the decision was taken out of her hands. Cutting through the rising tension, Song stepped forward and bowed before the Mayura. Honored elder, I would face one of your champions, the Tianxi said. The P-Fal peered down at her. Do I know you? The Mayura asked. I feel as if I should be pecking your head. I would prefer you do not, honored elder, Song politely requested. It was not possible for a bird to pout, given the lack of lips, but the spirit made a valiant attempt nonetheless. Fine, she sniffed. Refuse my blessing. The Mayura waited for a moment, perhaps hopeful calling it a blessing would change Song's mind, but was destined for disappointment. I await the introduction of your champions, Song said. The P-Fal left in a sulk, returning to the dais to begin her spectacle. Cascades of blue and green silk fell from the ceiling again, the sight less staringly impressive the second time. Curtains surrounded them on all sides as golden light began coursing down. Sounding more like a Learganese hawker than an ancient spirit, the Mayura began announcing her list of foes again. Hark! Will you face Oyez the Clever, who you must defeat in a contest of riddles where every mistake sees you lowered closer to a pool of Angerade only paid half-hearted attention to the list of champions, knowing there was yet time. At least 3 victories must still be earned to win the right to reach the very summit of the temple and the path to the toll road that lay there. Thangerai, master of myths and illusions, whose defeat must come by might of arms. Then there is, him, honored elder, Song said. Thangerai. I will face him. Oh, that's been a while, the Mayura enthused. Usually they choose an Ama instead, she sounds like a pushover. Angerade cocked her head to the side. Was the spirit not the one who had crafted the introductions? I was given to understand, Song said, that adding restrictions to the test yields greater advances. The spirit was visibly pleased at the implication. Also loudly. Yes, the P-Fal hissed. Tell me. If offer you 2 oaths, Song serenely replied. The first is that I will use only a single shot. That was not unwise, Angerade decided. It was rare to be able to reload one's gun during a duel, and Song had said nothing of her sort. It was a limitation, but not a crippling one. I receive your oath, the Mayura said, then hopped back and forth. Again. I shall not take more than a step away from where I stand when the test begins. The spirit cackled. Oh, that is fun, she said. I receive your oath. A pause. 3 takes you to the end, the spirit said. That means a change in terms. I listen, honored elder. If you lose, the Mayura said, you'll become one of my champions. A ripple of unease went through the crowd, though this was not news to Angerade. The P-Fal had already told her that the last test had this particularity to it. That is acceptable to me, Song replied. Shall we begin? When you're ready, the P-Fal happily nodded. The Tianxi's silver gaze swept through them. I will be leaving, then, she said. Kindly do not lower the number of victors in my absence. And on that sharp note, Song walked away. Angerade had never seen a test from the outside in this temple, so it was with a curious eye she greeted the changes in the golden light. What had before been letters and the silhouette of the champions spread out, the strokes thinning as they came to illustrate some kind of strange circular room. As if alive, the strands of gold moved as clouds of mist over a floor that was full of uneven rises and hidden pits. At the heart of it, sitting on a throne, a small bald man with a grand beard and a pot-belly was waiting. He had on his lap a mace with a thick head, a strange handle, like a saber's, with a knuckle bowguard. The Perdiri had never seen such a weapon before. It must be Someshwari. It would take time before Sung reached the grounds of the fight, Angharad knew from experience, so she found a pillar to lean against in a corner and drew back from the crowd. Lord Ishan seemed as if he might have wanted to chat, but he read her expression and elected to leave her in peace. No, it was another who sought Angharad out. Lady Isabel Ruesta had dressed with an eye to the practical, even though she was unlikely to be challenging a test today. A high-colored yellow doublet over a pale shirt matched hose of the same shade, tucked into elegant knee-high boots. The sole concession to traditional femininity was the feathered riding hat, angled coquettishly over her black curls. The infanzona was a feast for the eyes, as always, and Angharad would not soon forget how soft her skin had been under her fingers the evening when Isabel had visited her. Only she was not so certain she should be fond of that memory, now. The kindest possible mirror, Ferranda had called it. What would that mean, if it were true? Isabel came to stand by her side, hands over her lap. Silence held between them. Would not looking at the infanzona undo the effect of her contract, Angharad wondered? Or did Isabel perhaps need touch to see the veil over one's eyes? Angharad could not help but wonder, even knowing it was unfair, that Ferranda had accused without proof. But how would one go about proving the unseen? A fair question, but so was the opposite. How would one go about disproving it? At the end it was a matter of trust, and Angharad was feeling thin on trust. She had uncovered too many lies. It was tiring, to question everything. Enough that she thought it might be better to simply go her own way. "Hold out your hand," Isabel suddenly asked. Angharad stilled. The other woman noticed. "Ah," she said. "As I thought. Please allow me, then, a defense against the accusations Ferranda brought to you. Would it be unwise, to agree? Her contract at work?" Angharad could have let the dog chase each other's tails for hours and earn nothing but barks, so instead she set aside her own thoughts and doubts. If her mind was uncertain, then she need only avoid relying on her minds. Isabel Ruesta had been accused and was now asking for a way to prove her innocence that would not be harmful to Angharad. By honor's count, this should be allowed. Almost relieved that there was a way around the doubts, the Perdiri offered her hand. Isabel lightly touched it with the tip of her fingers. "Beginning now," she said. Angharad blinked, eyeing the other woman. A lie. She felt nothing at all. Or perhaps Ferranda's accusations had been most exaggerated. Isabel breathed out. "The Duchy of Peredur," Isabel Ruesta said, "is a barren chathal at the edge of the world, full of slack-jawed yokels who fuck seals and claimed they were mermaids." The Perdiri drew back in complete and utter startlement, though Isabel kept their hands connected. Past the first surprise at the unexpected vulgarity, anger rose. The infanzona had not only insulted her home, she had called her countrymen liars. Even in jest, and surely this must be in jest, for Isabel could not possibly believe it. The infanzona withdrew her hand and Angharad paused. Why could Isabel not possibly believe that? "I would have drawn a blade on most everyone here," the Perdiri said, "had they said what you just did. Even knowing it was to prove a point. It is best compared," she said, "to making a plain girl stand in flattering light and clothes. It does not change anything, not truly. A boy who prefers boys will still not take her to bed, nor will one who does not like redheads. But it makes the graceless graceful." "And I have been made to see the girl?" Angharad plainly said. Isabel inclined her head. "You have. If you were to choose to be angry over this," she said, "I would not dispute it." Angharad's answering look was cool. "What other choice is there, Isabel?" "Allowing me to explain," she replied. "Have I stopped you?" Angharad sharply said. The infanzona worried her lip. "I do not always control it," Isabel said. "When my emotions run high, whatever the emotion be, fear, joy, desire, hate, it makes no difference, I draw on the contract. Sometimes I do not even notice it." You could be lying, Angharad thought. And she could trust her own mind, not right now, so instead she trusted in honor. "Had you told me this, there would have been no breach in trust," she replied. "You did not." "I was afraid," Isabel admitted, and wronged you because of it. The dark-skinned woman breathed in at the stark admission. I will not excuse the act, the dark-haired beauty continued, but I would tell you what drove me to it, if you will allow. Angharad felt little sympathy, and even if she had honor would not have cared for reasons. Still, it was her responsibility to see the entire matter through before making a decision about cutting ties. She nodded permission. You must think me some kind of cold-blooded seductress, Isabel ruefully said, but that is not how it started. My parents, you see, wanted a boy. And when mother finally gave birth to one, suddenly I was no longer their favorite. She breathed out. In fan zones are taught as children that prayer answered is a dangerous thing, Isabel said. Mine was. I wanted to be the apple of my family's eye against, instead of that squalling stinking thing, and the beloved blossom offered me that. I have never heard of a spirit by that name, Angharad said. There is no reason you should, the Infanzona replied. She is no Mang, hardly an ancient power. But she was so lovely, so glamorous, and why should I distrust a goddess of love promising me that very thing? Only I was wrong, Angharad. Isabel's smile was a melancholy thing. She is, you see, not a goddess of love but of love novels. Angharad was perdury, she well knew how the difference of a single word could change everything. The Infanzona sighed. I did not realize what that truly meant until I was older, when the boys that had been my friends began falling in love with me every time I laughed, Isabel said. I learned to be wary, to control it, but fear is another emotion. Every time I felt dread at the approach of a suitor unwilling to accept a no, the contract bloomed anyway. Green eyes lowered to the ground. So I embraced it, she admitted. Used it to defend myself, set them against each other. Only the Ruesta are not the greatest house of Sacramonte, Angharad. We have superiors, those we must not offend. House Cherden, she quietly said. The way out was to marry above them, beyond their reach, Isabel said. And I found a man who would suit, whose contract even dulled my own, but my reputation followed me. He was courteous but kept his distance. Unwilling to give up, I decided to follow him to this island so that I might convince him. And the brothers? She asked. I needed them to win permission to come from my parents, the Infanzona said. And, well, I would not push them into danger, but should they seek it out themselves I would not weep of the consequences either. Angharad had some notion of what it was like, a boy of nobler blood wanting of you something you did not want to give. She had rubbed elbows with a Zinduna on the dueling circuit, and some of the young men had taken an interest it was not in her to return, and what noble house did not stand higher than the Tredegar, out in Malin? She fought against the sympathy, but it came anyway. Distrusting herself, Angharad reached for honor again. In her dealings with the Cherden, it could be said that Isabel Ruesta had kept to the exact lines of honor. Hardly in spirit, but that was not for Angharad to judge. It was between the two of them that trust had been broken. Why bring me into it? She asked. Isabel hesitated. It was duty, in part, to another noble, she said. But I will not pretend that I did not notice your eyes on me, or that I misliked the idea of having the protection of your sword arm, or, forgive the crudeness, of a discreet affair with a dashing stranger before stepping into married life. Only the man she had sought must have died when the first wave of trial-takers was slain to the last. Angharad could see how it had all unfolded from there, and found she believed the Infanzona. The tale fit the events. She could not take it as truth when she had already been deceived, but neither would she leap to call Isabel a liar. Not that it mattered, for Angharad would follow not her feelings but honor's lay. And honor tolerated no excuse for what had been done, the secret use of a contract on her. Had it been done by accident, then Isabel would still have been duty-bound to reveal it. And Angharad was not callow enough to believe it had all been done by accident. It is not my place to decide where honor lies between you and others, she finally said. Between us, however, offense was given. Out of respect for the aid you have lent me I will not pursue the matter, but any ties between us are sundered. Isabel's face tightened, but she nodded. Should I come to lead others again, or enter alliance, I would then be honor-bound to tell them what I can of your contract while avoiding your private affairs, Angharad added. The Infanzona hesitated. If you are willing to wait, she said, I promise to do this myself come the next sanctuary. I fear for my life should it be said before then. The Perduri cocked her head to the side, considering that it was not an unwarranted fear. Augusto might well try to blame her for everything. Should I suspect you of using your contract on another, I will have to intervene, she warned. That is only fair, Isabel replied without missing a beat. Angharad, reluctantly, thought better of her for it. Isabel Ruesta had done wrong, but she was not demanding the right to continue doing it from behind a shield of silence. Then I will agree to that, Angharad said, pushing herself off the pillar. I believe our conversation, and our ties, have reached a natural end. The Infanzona looked away, her head lowered enough locks were draped across her face. For a moment Angharad thought she saw cold anger there, but when Isabel turned to her again she found something closer to grief. So they have, Isabel sadly said. She inclined her head, Angharad jerking a knob back, and stepped away. The Perduri did not watch her leave, instead looking at the strands of gold still depicting the champion Song was to face. There was no trace of the Tianxi, an irritating thing even though Angharad knew it unreasonable to expect Song to have risen 4 shrines up in the amount of time it had taken her to speak with Isabel. Sighing, she forced herself to keep looking at the gold so that she would not have to see if others had noticed her conversation with Isabel. When steps came her way, Angharad decided that she would consider enough of Tunt by Tupac as a breach of truce and comport herself accordingly. Only when the person approaching cleared their throat, it was much too high-pitched. Turning a hard stare on whoever had thought it a sound notion to try her now, Angharad blinked when she saw Isabel standing before her. The Infanzona smiled a little shyly, offering her hand to kiss. Lady Isabel Ruesta, she said. Angharad began, then frowned in confusion. What is this, Isabel? There is nothing between us now, you said, the Infanzona replied. An empty slate. I would fill it again, only properly this time. Nothing has changed from moments ago, she said. Everything has changed, Isabel retorted. You know of my contract. You know my intentions and what brought me to the Dominion. There is no longer anything hidden between us. I am sure you can find another sword arm, Angharad sharply replied. There is no need to inflict this on either of us, Isabel. Angharad, the green-eyed woman patiently said, I no longer need a sword arm. I will not take Tess. My sole enemy, Augusto, has worn out several shovels digging his own grave. All that lies ahead of me is patiently waiting until others bring the trial to an end so I can stroll up the path to sanctuary and take a ship home. That was. Well, she could not find a part that was untrue. Not even when looking for a trap. I do not need anything from you, Isabel said. I seek your company because I desire it. A blank slate is not the promise of forgiveness, Angharad flatly replied. Then I will have to attempt to charm some measure of it out of you, Isabel said. The Infanzona had to know that the first whiff of the contract being used on her, Angharad would see it as an offense against her. And still she stood here. The Perduri said nothing, silence setting between them, but still Isabel stood there, offering her up her hand. Undaunted. I doubt it, Angharad said. She did not kiss the hand. Isabel still smiled before she walked away, joining Lan for a chat. As well she might. Angharad had replied with 3 words and not one had been no. Song's arrival had the entire room breaking into murmurs. The Tianxi, Angharad thought, looked sharper when drawn in gold. Her long braid like a single stroke, her chin like a knife. They watched as Song strode into the room where the champion waited, sitting on his throne. She stopped a dozen feet away from the throne, mist swirling around her. Could she see through it as they could, to the treacherous footing and hidden pits beneath? Angharad knew not, and it worried her. The lips of Song and the champion both moved, but there was no telling what they said. The details were not fine enough for that. Whatever the truth, the champion rose from his throne and idly swung his mace. The Tianxi did not move, bound to the oath of never straying more than a step away from where she stood, save for unsheathing her straight sword. Then Thangarai struck, and all breathed in. He leapt at Song, who swung through his throat, but the man turned into billowing mist. An illusion? Another Thangarai was back on his throne, laughing, while they could all see another sneaking behind Song while crouching low. The sneak struck at her from behind, but she narrowly parried the blow. Her sword gave, though, and the shaft of the mace still hit her leg. That would no doubt bruise. It was a storm of tricks and taunts after that, Thangarai dying a dozen times to her blade only to be revealed having a drink or lounging at the foot of his throne or picking up pebbles to throw at her. The one time she came close to cutting him down, when he tried a blow from the side after faking having been an illusion, he abandoned his weapon and threw himself into a pit. Moments later he was back out, weapon in hand. The champion was toying with her, Angharad thought. Song had yet to suffer more than bruises, but now Thangarai tried harsher and harsher blows. It was just a matter of time until she took a real wound, and it would be downhill from there. The noblewoman watched with a clenched jaw as Thangarai mocked her, dancing in close to strike at her with the mace. Only Song dropped her sword as she turned. The mace went right through the back of her neck, turning into mist, and the Tianxi snatched at thin air, grabbing the champion by throat. And when he opened his mouth, Angharad realized why Song had dropped the sword. She'd been drawing her pistol. They shoved it through his mouth, and smiled a cold golden smile before pulling the trigger. One shot, Angharad thought as Thangarai's brain splattered the mist. That was what that other woman had bargained for. Perhaps she ought not to have worried so much for Song Ren after all, Angharad mused as the others began to cheer. Song's journey back down was faster than the other way around. Angharad joined in with the congratulations, which were particularly enthusiastic from Shalini. No one asked the Tianxi how she had seen through the illusion, even though everyone had to suspect it was a contract. The Mayura had returned with Song. Happy at first, but that passed when it was confirmed they now had the right to rise to the summit of the temple fortress and take the path to the toll road. Everyone collected their packs, checked their weapons, and then they began moving. The Mayura pattered behind them nervously. Given the spirit's size and the sharpness of her beak, it would have been a worrisome sight, if the great peafowl did not look for all the world like a dog being abandoned. "You don't have to leave," the spirit said. "You can stay the night. You know. It's safe in here, and there used to be a pleasure temple, so there's plenty of beds." Lord Ishan, who she was addressing, slowed his steps and turned to bow to her as Shalini kept a wary eye on it all. "I thank you for the offer, Guardian, but we intend to reach the end of the maze today," Lord Ishan said. "We should not tarry. The road is terrible," the Mayura assured them. "Lots of you might die. You should probably just stay here." The Someshwari bowed again, giving no further answer. The peafowl tried again, but always she was politely put off. Cosm said he must bear news back to Sakramanti of a death. Akanthi foes claimed she could not sleep well in temples, and Lady Firanda replied that should she grow exhausted on the toll road she was sure to return. Tupac boldly counter-offered that the spirit should leave with him as his mount, which to everyone's alarm the Mayura seemed to consider. "I can't leave Kshetra's temple behind," she told Tupac. "Sorry. You seem like someone who gets in a lot of trouble. It might have been amusing. If you ever change your mind, find me," the Eastli casually replied. By the time the Mayura got to her, Angharad felt like the last in a line of boots about to kick a puppy. It was a senseless thing to feel. Of course, spirits were not men, could not be treated the same. The Mayura must be centuries old, for all that it seemed to have the mind of a cheerful child. Yet when the peafowl suggested she could stay and rest a bit, perhaps spar with the champion and rider, Angharad felt like a heel for refusing. "I am sorry, honored elder," she honestly said. "Had we the time to spare I would stay the night, but we yearn for the safety of the sanctuary that awaits us beyond the maze. Many of us have lost loved ones in this maze. It is not the quality of your hospitality that drives us to leave it." The Mayura's long neck drooped. She looked glum. "People never stay unless they're champions," she said. "I miss when people came to visit, before we crossed the water." "Are your champions not fine company?" she gently asked. "They forget a lot," the Peafowl muttered. I'm happy you fought Amrinder like you did, it brought back a lot of him. They were better when Kshetra was around, more alive. The bird sighed. I like that I can do whatever I want now, but I miss him sometimes, the Mayura admitted. He was a good god. Was it madness, Angharad thought, to see of herself in a spirit? To see a child surviving their kin, alone in a world that seemed so dark and kept closing in from all sides. It must be, and yet here she was, seeing that very thing. I miss my family as well, she softly said. I used to be glad to go away from them for months, out on the dueling circuit, but now I would give the world for having spent those days with them instead. She sighed. But I cannot change that, Angharad said. The past is beyond our reach. All we can do is learn from our regrets. She reached for her saber, unsheathing the blade as the Mayura watched her curiously. She held out her arm, cutting shallowly on her forearm, and wiped the blade before putting it away. With her now free hand she touched her blood, wetting the tip of her fingers, and smiled at the spirit. Lean forward, please, she asked. The Peafowl did, the desiccated corpse of the god on her back jangling forward. Angharad offered a bow. For your fine hospitality I give my thanks, honored elders, she said, and touched the edge of the golden cradle. Red stained the metal, though after but a heartbeat the vividness of the color faded. It is but a small offering, but I hope you will have joy of it, Angharad said. She bowed again, withdrawing a step, and the Mayura's long neck unbent. The spirit studied her, for a long moment, and then decisively nodded. You're nice, the Mayura decided. I like you. I like you too, Angharad smiled back. The Peafowl spirit was dangerous, but so were many of Angharad's companions. The Mayura was not ill-natured, not a drop of malice in her, and for that she had meant her words. You can have my blessing, the Peafowl allowed, presenting the top her head. The Perduri paused, unsure what to do. Pet the feathers, the Mayura instructed. They are very soft. Angharad could not contain a grin at how proud she sounded of that. With her clean hand she stroked the feathers, the Peafowl make noises of approbation. For a second it sounded as if the Mayura was whispering something, so Angharad leaned closer, but she must have misheard. It was still only that strange purring sound. After a while she ceased, the Mayura withdrawing her head. Good luck, the spirit told her. I hope you don't die before you die. Thank you, Angharad replied, slightly bemused. Still, she was in a lighter mood as she parted way with the spirit and caught up to the others. One was waiting for her at the back. Soft touch, Sung mocked, a smile tugging at her lips. Angharad stared haughtily down at her. Jealousy is unbecoming of you, Song, she said. It is not my fault you spurned her blessing when offered. You see right through me, the other woman dryly replied, hand over heart. They were both grinning by the time they caught up to the rest. They went all the way up, feet swallowing the stairs, until they emerged at the heart of the small tower overlooking precipitous heights. From there a small wooden bridge filled the gap, taking them to the edge of the great cliffs surrounding the fortress temple. Forward they went again, eager to find what lay ahead, and as the side of the cliff turned into a massive set of stairs they looked upon the promised toll road. It looked, Angharad thought, simple enough. At the bottom of the stairs waited a long stone bridge over a rapid river, across which they all saw a riot of lights. Lanterns by the hundreds hanging on what she was moved to see was the end of the cavern, a natural wall. And set into that wall, surrounded by a halo of lanterns, waited a great gate of bronze. Are we clear to cross? Shalini Gul asked, sounding surprised. I see no shrine left. Look closer at the bridge, Lady Firanda replied. It was only then Angharad noticed them. Markers like those used for miles back in Malin, raised stones. Set in the middle of bridge at precisely equal distance, 10 in whole. Someone cursed. Is every stone a test? Lord Zenzel asked. The fair-haired Fanzona nodded. The mood took a turn, as was only to be expected. To triumph over 10 gods was no small order, even for a group such as theirs. That is not the worst part, Firanda added. Every time a test has failed, that tenth of the bridge collapses into the river. I hear making a leap across one section is feasible, but two? She grimaced. Best not lose twice in a row, else we'll risk swimming. Chapter 36. They broke for an early lunch near the bottom of the stairs. It felt morbid to Angharad, having a meal looking down at what might become a grave for some of those eating, but she supposed it would have been even worse to stop halfway through the toll road and dine over the grave. They split into small groups for their meals of hard bread, cold pork and whatever tepid water they had left in their skins. Talk was quiet, as if the spirits below might be roused by too loud a conversation, and to the noblewoman it all felt like the breath before the storm. Only a different storm came calling. That Song would sit by her side for the meal was half expected by now, but only half. It would have been arrogance to go further than that, but it had not been Isabel's habit to do so unless the meal was communal. When the Infanzona elegantly set herself a step lower than them, it came as a surprise. Angharad made herself refrain from noticing how Isabel had unbuttoned her doublet and saw her respective heights allowed her a plunging view. Twice Song looked at Angharad. For a fever dream moment she thought that the other woman was trying to catch her looking, but the mounting incredulousness on the Tiangxi's face finally told her otherwise. Isabel's idle talk about Eastly fashions was interrupted by Song's sharp voice. Ruesta, it would be best for you to eat elsewhere. Are you so ardently in favor of asymmetrical skirts? Isabel replied, cocking an eyebrow. I had thought better of you. Song looked Angharad's way, as if prompting her to speak, and something of the gesture irked her. She was not a trained parrot, to speak when spurred so that courtiers could laugh. And she had told Isabel, for better or worse, that their slate was clean. It is only a meal, Song, Angharad said. It is a mistake, Song flatly replied. One you ought to know better than to commit. And there the Perduri was able to muster some steel at last. It was the most foundational of rights of a noble to decide who was allowed to sit at their table. Song was Republican, would not know better, but an unintentional insult was still that. I can decide, Angharad evenly said, who I eat with. And without a vote first, she almost added, but bit down on it. It was unworthy of her and the forbearance that Song had shown her on this isle. The Tiangxi's eyes narrowed nonetheless. Isabel, ever the peacemaker, attempted to cool the flames. I know we have not been on the best of terms, Song, she said. But I would make amends. You are, the Tiangxi rudely interrupted. Every bedside story for Tiangxi children made flesh. A useless, grasping thing that draws breath only by taking from those with skill, will or decency. Ye woo in the truest, most fundamental sense of the word. That, Angharad said, was uncalled for. Song turned her silver gaze on her and what the noblewoman saw there gave her pause. She had never seen the Tiangxi disappointed before, and it felt like a knife in the belly. Guilt was swift. Rudeness was not to be tolerated, but it was true that this was not Lan Hal's table. Had she not been forcing a guest on Song, herself breaching manners? I can also choose who I eat with, Angharad, Song said, popping the last of her bread in her mouth. She swallowed, then rose to her feet. And did. Song took up her pack and walked away. Angharad froze, her first instinct to follow but her mind arguing otherwise. Isabel's eyes found hers and for a searing moment she wondered if this had all been some scheme. If the Infanzona's contract had moved them both somehow, made them. You should go, the Infanzona advised. I did not mean to come between you two, Angharad. She then faintly grimaced, looking discreetly around them. And people are already noticing, Isabel said. It needs to be passed off as trivial. It had not even occurred to Angharad that eyes would be on them. But now that it did she felt a flush of humiliation. It felt not unlike being slapped in public, though it might well be her own palm responsible for the sting on her cheek. She nodded, rising to her feet. Song had hardly gone far, only a few steps away as she checked her munitions and belted her sword properly. The Tiangxi did not acknowledge her standing there, so Angharad waited awkwardly for a time before finally clearing her throat. You should finish your meal, Song said. There will not be another opportunity for ours. Angharad could not apologize, for she had not done anything wrong. It would have been slighting her own honor to make apologies for nothing. I did not properly grasp, she finally said, the depths of your dislike for Lady Isabel. That is my failing. Father had taught her that. If you cannot apologize, instead acknowledge a mistake of your making. It will carry much the same meaning and represent a concession besides. She could almost hear his voice, the sound of their boots on the gravel as they strolled around the gardens, and Angharad ached with the loss of it. She would never hear his voice again. Any of their voices. My dislike, Song bit out. Circle and gods. The Tiangxi glared up, but she pitched her voice low. You heard the same thing I did, Angharad, Song said. How her contract works. Why would ever allow her in your presence again, to dig her hooks into your mind? She has admitted her wrongdoings and apologized, Angharad replied. I cut ties over it, calling our score even. So now she's making a new score, Song sighed. Since you have a blank slate. The noblewoman shuffled uncomfortably. How do you know she is not using her contract on you? Song asked. I do not, Angharad said. But the same is true of everyone I have had dealings with. She has demonstrated her contract to me, and though I cannot swear I would be able to tell were it used on me, it can only achieve so much. The filter is not the most dangerous part, Song said. She paused at Angharad's open confusion. That is what her contract is, Song said. A perception filter that lets you see the good and dims the bad. The Perduri frowned. And how would you know that? The slightest pause. Because I've almost entirely deciphered her contract, Songran evenly replied. For a moment Angharad thought she had misheard, for what she had just been told was absurd. Decipher another's contract. Only a god and their contractor could ever know such terms, and it was not as if the pact was some scroll in a library that. Yet Song's face remained deadly serious, and so Angharad swallowed. She could either call the Tiangxi a liar or take her at her word, and Song had never once lied to her. They would kill you for that, she hoarsely said. She did not put a name to they, for there were too many to count. It is not as rare or potent an ability as you think, Song told her. There was a contractor at the old fort who could do something similar, though by sniffing out the gods. The High Queen's court employs such bloodhounds by the dozen, Angharad dismissed. But you speak of deciphering terms, Song. Of being able to read some of the most precious, dangerous secrets in all of Vesper simply by being in the same room. And I told you that my pact is not as potent as you think, Song replied. Deciphering is not an exaggeration. Why do you think I learned so many languages? Oh, Angharad thought, and then suddenly it occurred to her that Song might be able to see her own contract. No, she told me she cannot read Gwent, the Perduri remembered. And surely her contract with the fisher must be written in the old tongue. She swallowed, knowing that she would only get an answer if she asked. Can you did you? I have the loosest sense of what your contract can achieve, Song said. But it is very difficult to look at, as if I were reading with my eyes open underwater. A heartbeat of hesitation. I have been advised not to look too closely, the Tiangxi admitted. That your gods is temperamental. The fisher was not, at least in the way the other woman must have meant it. The fisher was not a thing given to fits of rage, to passing tantrums. The rage in him was old and deep, carved into the bone and unchanging. I have known kinder storms, Angharad quietly said, for she would not say more. She sighed, resisting the urge to fiddle with her braids. Mother had always slapped her hands when she did, called it an unfortunate habit. I would ask that you keep your knowledge of my contract secret, she stiffly asked. It was walking very close to the lines of honor to request such a thing, but it must be done if she was to ever return to the kingdom of Malin. I am not a gossip, Song said. Principles aside, to run my mouth in such a way would likely get me killed. Though as I will not speak of your pact, I would ask you extend me the same courtesy. Angharad shallowly nodded, suspecting she had not quite hit her relief from the silver gaze. Given what I have told you, Song continued, I would repeat what I said earlier, the most dangerous part of Ruesta's contract is not the filter. That is the habit it induces. She paused, looking for words. Once you grow used to seeing the good in someone, your mind follows down that road habitually, the Tianxi said. She does need to use her contract constantly, because she has taught everyone around her to assume the best of her actions. Her blank slate is favorable. Angharade frowned. What you describe, she said, sounds not unlike trust. Keeping faith and doing good deeds resulting in a worthy reputation was not sinister, it was the very nature of civilization. Song looked irritated. Not earned trust, she said. Fostered. Then it was simply giving the benefit of the doubt, which Angharade saw nothing all that sinister in either, but she could see saying as much would only further trouble Song. That a contract had been involved complicated things, but to use one's reputation was not an evil act. The act of using the contract on another without their knowledge was where the breach of honor lay, and that part Isabel had addressed. I hear your concerns, Angharade said. And I would not be comfortable serving as shield to one intending to use their contract on others. But, Song said. She has sworn not do so, save by accident, the Perduri said. And then to reveal her contract publicly once sanctuary is reached. Song looked at her for a very long time, silver eyes hooded. What went on behind them she could only guess at, for the other woman's face was calm as a pond on a windless day. If you hear my concerns, then act on them, Song finally said. Do not speak to Isabel Ruesta alone. It chafed, for someone to try to dictate to her like this, but Angharade swallowed her dislike. It was a request not made high-handed but out of concern for her safety. She could bend her neck that much, so the dark-skinned noble nodded in concession. And once we reach the next sanctuary, please cut ties properly, Song said. She will have no need of your protection, having that of the blast cloaks, and should face the consequences of her actions without an intercessor. Angharade grimaced. A steeper term but not, she thought, one unreasonable to ask. I have no intention of staying long in sanctuary anyhow, she reminded herself. And tempting as the thought was to let Isabel make a private apology now that she knew the contract had little to do with her attraction, a filter could not make something out of nothing, she could not in good conscience linger at sanctuary for that purpose alone. It would be highly frivolous. We will part ways at the sanctuary, she conceded. And I had no intention of intervening when she is to recover her honor, but should you want me to take an oath no need for that, Song said, shaking her head. Your word is enough. How easily that answer came was almost enough to make Angharade feel guilty for what she had done. Namely, cutting out the mention of time from the promise. It was cracking a door slightly open, nothing more. So she told herself. There was still some stiffness between them after that, not every wrinkle smoothed, but Song stood by her side when everyone gathered to take the last steps down together. It would be different now, Angharade thought. Thing always were when you realized you could lose something you had taken for granted. The stone marker stood tall as a man and about as broad. It was bare of carvings and adornment, nothing more than a roughly hewn slab of granite standing sentinel as the entrance of the bridge. Angharade could hear the roiling current of the river below, see white foam and sharp rocks bathed in golden light from above. Ferranda had told them that to fail a test was for a tenth of the bridge to fall below, and Angharade saw only death in those waters. If we lose twice in a row, we are finished. It would be too broad a gap to cross, even with ropes. As the survivors, all 14 of them, stood before the marker, there was a heartbeat of hesitation. Who was to be the first of those not yet crowned victors? Song had removed herself from that list, and quite boldly. So the eyes went to those that remained, Lan, Brun, Uretsi, Cosmoflor and Lady Ferranda. Angharade hid her surprise at who took the initiative. I shall take the vanguard, then, Cosmoflor said, rolling his shoulders. Wish me luck. Courage, Angharade thought, from one she had not expected to have such a virtue. Yet he must be a coward at heart, for why else would he have returned to Augusto Cherdon's side? If the mangled Infanzon was worried at the notion of losing his protector, it did not show. Augusto's face was a study of nonchalance. Try not to die, Tupac casually replied. It would be inconvenient to have to pull out all the stops as early as the second test. You're all hard, Sickle, the man snorted, stroking his mustache. He stepped forward onto the bridge, and the air shivered. They could see all that followed clearly, for though all had put away their lanterns, the few real ones, but also the iron things the watch had gifted them, the golden light of the machine above made it look like a strange summer day. The stone cracked, a creature ripping itself free of the cracks. It was a centipede, a filthy horror, all crawling legs and large as a man's torso. The legs got larger as they went up and ended in a head of twisted curved mandibles. It looked like a skull atop a rib cage, though all of it carapace sordidness. Cosm, to his honor, did not flinch. "God of the land, I greet you," the older man said. "Pick a weapon," the spirit said, its voice like plunging your hand in a pit of maggots. "Wield and face it, slay my puppet to win passage." The older man remained silent for a time, then sighed. "Knife," he said. Not a respectable weapon, but then Cosm had proved to be anything but. "Agreed," the spirit laughed. Cosm floor loosened his sword belt, dropping it on the stone floor, then his pistol and powder followed. It was the long knife strapped to his side he drew, the shine of fine Someshwari steel catching the golden light from above. Yet Angharad's eye was on the spirit instead, who was shaking and twisting as it vomited a river of filth. Bile and mucus full of squirming, foul things shaped themselves into a man inch by inch. Cosm's height and build were matched, the spirit at last spewing out something like chitin that the puppet took in hand. Threading fingers through the filth, the silhouette shaped the material into a mirror of Cosm's own knife, as if it were clay to be molded. The older man spat to the side. "I've seen worse in the murk," Cosm said. "Try harder." "Begin," the spirit hissed. Both struck. Before the second pass had ended, Angharad knew why Cosm had chosen the knife. She had seen him shoot a pistol and in passing use a sword, but he was nowhere as deft a hand with them as he was the sharp length in his hand. It was a brutal bout, more like the tangle of back alley cats than an honored duel. Cosm struck with his fists as well as his knife, gouged eyes, and on the third pass ended up rolling on the floor with the horror trying to choke it out. Even as cuts opened the skin of both, bile and blood spilling in a foul puddle, the mustachioed soldier did not flinch even when the puppet's features turned into a nest of screeching centipedes. He cut and gouged and choked, until they were on their feet again and swinging. The cut that ended the fight was the costliest. Cosm slid under the monster's guard, striking its chin with his palm and rocking it back as it swung past him. Then he closed in, ramming his knife into the puppet's throat and ripping it open, but the creature pressed against him and stabbed into his back. It struck again and again, wailing away the flesh until Cosm's knife was all the way through its throat and the head came tumbling down. It collapsed back into the vileness the spirit had spewed out, drenching the soldier who roared out a curse, but the puppet was done. Cosm ripped out the chitin knife he had stuck in him and threw it over the edge of the bridge. "Told you," he panted out. "Shame how bile got in the wounds," Tupac idly noted. "If Tredegar had not gotten our friend Tristan killed, he might have seen to that." Angharad ignored the insult and the bickering that followed it, eyes staying on Cosm. He had been stabbed 5 times, but with his coach he could not tell how deep it had gone. He still seemed able to move his arm, at least. Yet blood loss alone would ensure he was far from at his best. That was a loss, for the purpose of crossing the bridge. It was a gain for when the time would come for Augusto Cherdenzian to find him. The spirit whose blunt test they had beaten did not deign to humor them with a confirmation, instead slithering back into the crack it had emerged from. Yet the bridge did not collapse when they gingerly began to walk, as plain a crowning as they would get. Cosm hung back, Augusto helping him dress his wounds, and Angharad avoided both. In time she would face them both, but until then it was beneath her to loom like some sort of scavenger and pick at their wounds. She joined the gathering before the second stone marker instead. "I will take the second," Brun told everyone. Some murmurs of approval. "Good luck," Lan sweetly said, smiling very wide. It was heartening, Angharad thought, to see some fine camaraderie between Sacramontans after all the backbiting of their infanzones. The pair must have been friends. This time the spirit was not so unpleasant to behold. When the stone cracked, what emerged was almost human. It looked like a smooth, gentle child whose face was wrinkled with old age. It spoke in a voice sweet as the flowing of water, offering its test. "I will run around my part of the bridge, screaming," the spirit said. "You must touch me with a hand to win. You have 900 breaths to do so." Bronn carefully ensured that the spirit would be tangible, then haggled the terms. The strange spirit refused to remove the time limit but conceded that in exchange it would not seize Bronn's soul should he lose, only if he died during the test. It seemed well bargained to Angharad, but of course it was not so simple as that. Within the heartbeat of the test beginning, the spirit turned invisible. It took Bronn by surprise, the fair-haired man having clapped his hands over his ears, perhaps in the anticipation of the spirit's screaming being harmful. It had been her guess as well. Angharad was not the one taking the test, so it might be different for her, but as far as she could tell the only harmful thing about the screams was that they were so exaggerated it sounded like the spirit was making sport of them. Still, though the creature was invisible it made noise and the touch of its feet on the floor could barely be made out. Bronn had his contract as well, though by the way the Sacramontan began blindly reaching into thin air Angharad suspected his power could not detect the spirit at all. Yet for all the difficulties the man was clever and quick, only he seemed inexplicably clumsy today, as if his limbs had slowed. It was a small thing, but always he seemed to miss the screaming and giggling spirit by inches. Was the creature using some sort of power to slow him? It was near the end of the time that the test turned dangerous. The spirit began to hide near the edge of the bridge, and it baited Bronn near the edge again and again. Twice it tried to kick him down into the waters, the second time almost succeeding. By the time the 900th breath had passed, the spirit had not been caught. "Missed me," it laughed, coming back into sight for a moment long enough to grin. A tenth of the bridge collapsed under it, falling chunk by chunk. Angharad ran to the edge even as Bronn did the same, the fair-haired man leaping as his footing disappeared under him. She caught his arm, grunting as she dragged him forward. His knees still hit the edge of the bridge, no doubt bruising them, but Angharad got him back on the bridge. They both collapsed on the floor and Bronn rolled away, revealing a face that still seemed calm even having come so very close to dying. It was, she thought, impressive nerve on the man's part. "Congratulations, Rat," Augusto Cherdon drawled. "You're our first failure of the day." Angharad turned a cool gaze on him. "Worry not, Lord Augusto," she said. "You will always be such in my eyes, no matter the day." "Ha!" Zenzel chortled, and he was not alone. Augusto was not beloved. Eyes turned to the newly formed gap, after that, and though some, Tupac and Lan, suggested the leap could be made without help others prevailed on a hook and rope being used. It took a quarter-hour to fix 2 hooks against the stone on the other side of the bridge, but after that the crossing on 2 parallel ropes was not all that difficult. The cautious crossed on all fours, the rest trusted their footing. All were aware that a second defeat in a row might well kill them all, so there was no talk of anyone taking up the test before its nature was revealed. The stone cracked and 2 wriggling shapes shot out, unfolding like paper cranes. Angharad winced at the sight of them, for the pair of spirits she beheld wore the shape of the dead. With bulging eyes, skin gone gray and their 2 long ghastly tongues hanging loose, the spirits looked like hanging victims. Both held onto the stone marker with sharp fingernails, swaying as they considered their supplicants. "Play with us," the spirit to the left said. It choked on its tongue as it spoke, and the sound would have been comical if not for the ugly rasp to the words. Like rope coiling tight, like gulping at air that would not come. "To come to play," the spirit to the right said. "Zhao Zian Shao." A strike to the face for every missed clap, and no one could step in. Unease spread like malignant air as Angharad shot a glance at Song, hoping for a translation. The Tiangxi frowned. "It means little lines," she said. "But I do not know the meaning. It's a children's clapping game in the republics." Gazes swiveled to the speaker, Your Etsy, who looked uncomfortable at the weight of the attention she was receiving. She toyed with one of her turquoise earrings. "I am surprised you never heard of the game," Your Etsy continued, cocking an eyebrow at Song. "I was taught of it because how staggeringly common it is over all of Tianxia. I had a strict upbringing, Song admitted. That felt like a very long story forced into a very short sentence, Angharade thought. Eyes moved to Lam, who laughed. Hey, don't you fine folk glare at me, the blue-lipped woman said. I've got the Tianxi look, but I was born in Sacramonte. We played Slap-a-Liar like all the other kids. What a horrifying name. Your Etsy cleared her throat. I believe the game is also called the Lamp Song Around the Caribbean Sea, she said. The words are different in Antigua, but not the rhythm and movements. That found purchase. I know that one, a cane thiefos called out. Used to play it with my brothers. It will have to be the two of us, then, your Etsy said. Unless we are to teach the game to others. I am not sure that would be wise, Song said. Clapping games are rote repetition, no? Meaning even someone with finer reflexes might not do as well as someone who simply knew the order of movements down to not needing thought. I take it the game is more complex than simply clapping left and right? Angharade asked. There's two sequences with up, down and a finger snap, your Etsy replied. Then for the second part you do them the opposite way. It sounds risky for someone new to learn them, then, Angharade opined. There was some argument. Lord Zenzel suggested that Shalini and her unnaturally quick hands might be a sure bet, until she asserted that her contract might instead make her the single less suited person present, but eventually it was agreed that your Etsy and Lady Akanthi would be their champions. After that it was only a matter of being cautious. They asked that the spirits demonstrate the game with each other, to make sure it was the same they knew, and then settled the stakes. So long as one finished the game and forfeit without dying, the spirits agreed, the test would be considered as passed. Only in exchange for that they demanded should either your Etsy or Akanthi miss 5 claps in a row, their lantern would be forfeit. Understandably, neither was pleased by this. It is the best deal we are likely to get, Lady Firanda said. Easy to say, when your soul is not on the line, Akanthi bit back. You would do well, Zenzel Duma mildly said, not to confuse patience with forgiveness. Lady Akanthi. You will have none of that from me after the trial of lines, or from most standing here, I think. The acne-scarred lady glared at them all, then grit her teeth. Fine, she said. I'll do it. But I am already a victor and now risking myself a second time. In exchange, I must not be called upon for another test until we reach the end of the maze. Some tried to argue against, but it was half-hearted work. Angharade though at a reasonable demand, and so she bent her neck along the others. The pair stepped forward to face the spirits, who crawled all the way out of their marker to sit down on the ground. Their loose, wide-sleeved gray coats pooled on the floor as they tucked in their long-nailed teeth underneath the fold of blue robes ending at their ankles. Settling face to face, the pair stilled and began to play. The trick used by the spirits should have been obvious, but Angharade had not thought of it. Though their hands moved unnerringly, both began singing a different song. Neither was the right song. Akanthi, taken aback, missed 2 claps in a row before catching up. It was your Etsy that helped her, loudly singing the true tune as she kept going. The diplomat, Angharade was impressed to see, had not missed a beat. After that the spirits began to pull every trick they could. They slowed or quickened their hands, presented the grim sight of their heads turning all the way around, through mockery and insults. Twice more Akanthi missed claps, and your Etsy finally missed as well. The rest of them hung on to every gesture, knowing there was nothing at all they could do. The most prudent among them retreated close to the gap, perhaps intending on attempting a leap back if the test was failed. Angharade doubted it would amount to anything. Besides, for all that now and then a beat was missed, neither seemed anywhere near the 5 in a row that would lose their soul. They need only until. The first sign something went wrong was when Akanthi winced after a particularly hard clap. The spirit facing her leaned in, leering, and struck even harder. It got a yelp of pain out of the noble girl. Angharade could only gawk at the sight. It had been a hard clap, but surely not enough to hurt Akanthi. Had her hand already been wounded? Only it was both hands that had her moaning as the spirit began putting its back into the slaps. Until with a sickening sound Akanthi's left wrist snapped. Cleanly broken. Her contract's price, Angharade thought. Has to be. No one alive had bones so weak. Keep going, your Etsy hissed. They only need 5 to 1 clap missed, 2, 3, 4, and Acanthe dragged up her broken hand, screaming as the clap rippled down her arm. She barely managed another clap after that, weeping and gibbering, and missed 3 more after. Again her bad hand went up, a scream ripping itself clear of her throat as the spirit slammed its palm against hers, but while she began missing claps again your Etsy finished a discordantly cheerful rhyme and Cathayon and the game ended. Angharade breathed out. Never 5 in a row. Acanthe foes would keep her soul. Good, good, the spirit to the left said. Lovely game. The forfeits now, yes? The one to the right struck without warning, its knuckle catching Acanthe in the chin. She fell back, screaming more in surprise than pain. Your Etsy took her own blow more carefully, rolling with it. The difference in training showed. Acanthe was struck again while on the ground, right in the eye. It was certain to blacken, and then your Etsy got her turn again. It was, however, the last blow the Eastleigh diplomat would get. She had only missed 2 claps. Acanthe foes had missed many more than that. It would have been too much of a compliment to call what followed an execution. It was a murder, nothing more than that, brutal and drawn out and gleefully done. They all watched in anguished silence as the spirits toyed with their victim, changing who held her down and who struck. After 5 blows, Acanthe's face was a bloody mess. By the 8th it was beyond bruised flesh, her nose broken and cartilage peeking out. On the 9th her cheekbone broke. On the 10th she lost her eye and began choking on her own blood. The spirits waited after that, Acanthe's head in one's lap as she gurgled and died. Finish your last blow, you foul things, Angharade snarled. 11 is all you won. Laughter. We never said how long between blows, a spirit said. Wait and see. It wasn't the blood that killed Acanthe, at least not the blood she was choking on. She began convulsing, something in her skull broken from a blow, and died with a plaintive wheeze. And as the last breath left her, the spirit to the right gently flicked her cheek with a sharp nail. 11, it said. 1 survived. You may pass, now. They went back into their stone, bellies full, and silence reigned in their wake. Angharade closed Acanthe's eyes and Song helped her throw the body into the river after so that carrion would not pick at it. It was little, but all they had to give. The spirit that awaited beyond was a fox in silver, its brisk manners welcome after the sordidness of the last test. Thrice will I release birds, the fox said. Only one will be true, and this one you must slay before it flees beyond your reach. A hunter's challenge and hunter stepped forward to meet it. Lady Ferrand of Elazar, her musket already in hand, claimed the test. She haggled only a little with the fox spirit, which had Angharade frowning. Better terms might have been had with a little effort. As they stood they were quite vague and, she finally thought. Song had idly come to stand a few feet behind Ferranda, and the ploy was made clear. The spirit released 5 gulls from its back, the lovely thing's images in perfect silver taking flight. Second from the left, Song stated. A flint struck, powder burned, the gull dropped and already Ferranda was reloading her musket. That is not the spirit of the test, the fox insisted. It is not against its rules, god of the land, Ferranda flatly replied. Again. Irked, the spirit no longer showed restraint. It was a dozen small birds that erupted from its back in a flock, silver sparrows, but again Song called the shot and Ferranda took it. The spirit only grew angrier, the last time unleashing a veritable swarm of birds of all shapes and sizes. That proved to be a mistake, for the differences made the target even easier to call. Cormorant, middle left, Song said. The fox was gone before the dead bird even hit the ground, angrily burrowing back into its stone. How thoroughly the test had been beaten brought back some boldness to their lot, straightening backs, but Angharade thought it would take more than a single victory to erase the shadow left by Acanthe's brutal death. 11 victors, now, Tupac noted. Almost halfway through and we can still afford a corpse. Unpleasant as his words were, they were true enough no one took him to task over them. The 5th of the 10 markers was inhabited by the most unsettling spirit yet. It was a 2-headed snake, its scales of vivid green and red, But it was not the reptile that spoke to them. When those fanged maws opened, they revealed the small heads of infants inside. "A simple game," the serpent said. It slithered along the ground, oil trailing in its wake and slowly coming to trace a perfect grid of 10 by 10, covering all of its section of the bridge save for a few feet across. "To play," the serpent spirit said. "You can cross when there are no eyes on you, but when there are you cannot. If you were caught moving, you were thrown back 10 feet. You have 700 breaths to cross." Ishan immediately hammed in on the loophole she had. "And will you stand at the same place the entire time?" he asked. "I will not move," the serpent conceded. "Not impossible, then, though no doubt there would be some sort of trick to it." "Seems like my kind of game," Lan easily said, stepping forward. "1, the serpent said. "Come now, not so fast," the blue-lipped woman said. "The last time it tested a set amount of time, the god did not get a soul out of a loss, only a death. It seems only fair for the same terms to apply again." "Insolent rat," the serpent spirit scathingly replied. "You have me dead to rights," Lan grinned. "And I'm no great athlete either, easy to catch. I'd be splendid fodder, if you bothered to lure me in properly." The infant's mouth inside the maw pulled into a pout, which had Angharad shivering in disgust. It was tempted, though, and conceded in exchange for the concession that standing on the line would also be enough to get you thrown back 10 feet. The terms were agreed to by the second who would take the test, Augusto Cherton. It was with narrowed eyes that Angharad watched him step forward. What did the Infanzon gain by this? He was already a victor and taking risks would win him no friends. Or was he a victor? Augusto might be nobly born, but he had no honor. He might well have lied about a victory to save his life. Yet he would have needed to fool not only her but also Tupac who was frowning at the Infanzon, looking surprised for once. "It does not matter anyway," Angharad reminded herself. "We are under truce until the tests are done." "Prepare yourself," the serpent spirit said. "We begin." The two positioned themselves at the edge of the line, preparing to move. The snake turned its head and they shot forward, only gaining half a foot before it turned back. Neither were standing on the line. "Tricky, tricky," the spirit complained. Again. It turned and again the pair moved, only a heartbeat later both went flying, thrown back by an invisible force. "Hey," Lan complained, dusting herself off as she rose. "Your eyes weren't on us." "Did I say anything about my eyes?" The serpent spirit smiled with a toddler's mouth. It was then Angharad realized that the other she could no longer see the other head. "Shit," Sang quietly said. "They are two spirits, not one." The Tianxi was right, the second head had split into another snake entirely, now standing on another side of the grid. It grinned at them all as Angharad went back over the wording of the terms in her mind. The spirit was right, it had never specified only its eyes would count and promised only it would not move from its position. As was often the way with spirits, though, they did not make the bargain impossible to fulfill. The snakes left slight openings for the pair to advance, slight but enough that the pair could gain an inch or two at a time. Only they needed to maneuver precisely every time, and 10 successes were tenfold undone by a single mistake. Whichever spirit caught them threw them back in the direction opposite them with that invisible force, and as the pair were toyed with by the creatures Angharad began to glimpse the enemy's plan. Lan and Augusto were caught more often by the snake on the side, slowly moved to the left edge of the grid. The same that ended mere feet away from a bridge with no railing. "One must love the Trebian Sea," Lord Zenzel snorted. "The only place in all the world where it is the fish that fish you." Angharad might have felt a sliver of amusement, if it were only Augusto's life on the line. Lan, though, did not deserve such an end. The pair realized their trouble soon enough, taking greater care with the spirit on the side, but there was only so much they could do. "Caught you," the spirit crooned, and Angharad saw their newest trick. It was only the snake on the side that would catch the pair stepping on the line, forcing them to the side. And Lan was shoved roughly 10 feet nearer to the edge, half finger's width away from the furthest line of the grid. One more mistake and she'd be over the edge. She went very, very still. "You bitch," Augusto snarled. You can't wait the test out, we'll both." He went flying as well, landing on his knees but a foot behind Lan. He swallowed his words, face gone pale. Neither moved, but knowing they were a single mistake away from death. Only neither of their poses were all that comfortable. Augusto was sitting on the back of his own foot, and the gazes of the serpents stayed on them unblinking. They could breathe, if shallowly, but not even swallow. The gazes went away and Lan swallowed, but Augusto was bolder. He unfolded his leg, which he had been sitting on. The spirit on the side turned its gaze back on him before he could finish, leaving him stuck halfway. He froze, did not move an inch, but his leg began to tremble. The pose was too hard to maintain. The trembling a little, at first, but it got worse. He was shaking. With a scream of terror, Augusto chaired and toppled to the side and the spirit screeched in glee through a toddler's lips. A heartbeat later he was over the edge. Angharade, rope in hand, stepped forward. In the water she could see the Infanzon, how he had landed on one of the rocks in the rapids. He screamed like a seagull, impaled through the side and only that slow death keeping the current from sweeping him away to a faster one. "Cosme," Augusto screamed. "Cosme, help." The mustachioed man looked over the edge, stood there for a long time, then shook his head. "You won't survive that," he replied. "Best go with the current, Augusto. It will be faster." "You fucking cock," the Infanzon shouted. "You're a traitor. Isabel, throw me a rope, I order you." Isabel Ruesta walked away, out of his sight. She looked distressed. "Tredegar," Augusto tried, growing panicked. "You can't leave me to die, there's no honor in this." "There is." Angharade met his eyes, for a long moment, and thought of that night in the woods when he had fired the pistol. Tried to kill half of them so he might live a little longer. She looked away. By the time the span of the test ended, the screams had turned to sobs. When the portion of the bridge began to collapse, Angharade threw Lan the rope and dragged her up with Firanda's help. The stone falling in the river drowned out even Augusto's sobs, and then there was nothing heard from him at all. Buried in stone and water, not even his corpse was there to be seen. They set up the ropes and crossed again. The sixth marker cracked open to reveal what Angharade thought to be a headless dog, until it rose on its back feet and revealed its stomach was a frog-like face. "I will release a fly," the spirit said. "The first to catch it wins." Shalini stepped forward, grim-faced. "I'll take that one," she said. No one contested her, as the superficial of her contract were an open secret. Bargaining was brisk and successful. The spirit opened its mouth, spitting out a fly the size of a bullet, and as it buzzed away Shalini shot the spirit in the eye faster than Angharade could follow. It screamed in anger, turning on her, but she ignored it and shot forward herself. It was a harsh trade. Just before Shalini's fingers closed around the fly, the spirit's long barbed tongue darted out and ripped into her shoulder. The spirit cursed around its own tongue, lips flapping, but there was no denying the fly was in the Someshwari's hand. "We're done," she grunted. "Get that goddamn tongue out of me." Her lips thinned until they turned bloodless as the spirit did exactly as she had asked, none too gently. The barbs, Angharade saw, did more damage on the way out than they had going in. The wound is still shallow, she thought. It was meant to inflict pain, not cripple. Had Shalini Gol used her contract once or twice, Angharade wondered? That shot had been too quick to be anything but that, but her hand when she had snatched the fly had been barely any slower. "Oh," Lan faintly said from behind her. "That can't be good." Angharade followed the Tiangxi's eyes and went still. The spirit they had just beaten had not even returned to its stone, yet already the marker ahead of them had cracked open, revealing some sort of cat made of worms. So had the two markers beyond that one, their spirits coming out. A spirit shaped like Skinless, one-legged man let out a resounding scream and only ceased when the worm cat leaped at its throat and tried to rip into it. The last spirit, a black horse whose back turned into a spider's, struck at both with its hooves. Lord Ishan had claimed that Shalini's contract drew attention, Angharade recalled as she watched the spirits begin to tear into each other. Her use of it so close when they were starved must have whipped them into a frenzy. "Well now," Tupac drawled, That does simply things. No, Song suddenly said. Look at the bridge. Cracks were spreading, Angharad saw. Every time a spirit tore into another, wounded what they were, the part of the bridge their marker held together began to break. We need to run, she said. Now. Within 3 steps the first chunk of bridge had fallen. Angharad glimpsed ahead, taking a hard left when she saw she had been about to fall into the river as a hole opened in the floor. Ishan looked about to tip over the edge, so she yanked him back, then dragged him along with her. The man tried to thank her, but she kept moving. Cracks spread, louder and louder as the bridge began collapsing behind them. It was blind, heedless run forward that Angharad broke only by feverish glimpses forward, never more than half a second, taking hard turns to avoid death. The cat spirit let out a scream as its head was gobbled down by the horse spider, its entire chunk of the bridge falling down behind them. Go, 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 Angharad exhorted the others. By the time they'd reached the brawling pair, the skinless man was biting into the other's flesh with 2 large square teeth. It turned when Shalini approached, as if drawn by the feel of her, but the other spirit used the distraction to cave in its bare ribs. The bridge ahead of them began to collapse, but they were already there, already running, and Angharad leapt, shouting at the top of her lungs, and the others followed behind. She landed on her belly, chin hitting the stone painfully, and barely got out of the way before Tupac landed in a crouch where her legs had been. Angharad hastily rose to her feet, counting the survivors, and as the number rose her hopes did, 10, 11, 12. They had all made it, she realized in a moment of pure joy as she watched Lady Firanda drag Shalini up from the ledge she had been hanging onto. Sleeping God, she smiled. A cracking sound interrupted her, whisking away the joy. She turned, hand on her sword, as the mark revealed the last spirit. The last test. Her belly clenched in anticipation. It was not as wrong as some of the others, not wicked or warped. The spirit looked almost like a whale that had grown 4 legs, all pale wet flesh, though it was smaller than any whale known to men, barely the size of a horse. Its breathing was loud, and when it opened its mouth it was to reveal rows on rows of teeth so fine they looked like hair. 2 must face me and not bleed, the spirit said. Until you have wounded me thrice. Any who bleed before then surrender their lantern. The voice was slow, lazy, and Angharad blinked away a wave of exhaustion as her veins suddenly cooled. The fisher was not pleased by the other spirit's encroachment, she could tell. It would only grow angrier if the spirit persisted, she thought, and so that made her a natural choice for this test. I will make one, Angharad said, stepping forward. And I the second. Her jaw clenched as Tupac's sickle swaggered up, spear on his shoulder. For all her hatred of the man, he was a skilled fighter. If there was to be a test of martial strength, she would not turn him away. Pushing aside her reluctance, she acknowledged him with a nod. He returned it, along with a smirk that had her considering throttling. Let us discuss terms, honored elder, Angharad said. The spirit was not interested in trading time for fewer hits, or making assurances too precise about what it might use to pursue them. It only conceded it would not shrink the space of the bridge. There will be a trick to hitting it, Tupac told her. I expect there will be, Angharad said, and breathed in. Angharad Trudiger and Tupac Sickle accepted the terms, beginning the test. The spirit was quick for its size, charging without batting an eye, but neither its opponents were amateurs. They danced around it as it struck with tail and grasping maw, Tupac scoring a blow on its side. Only the flesh did not part. The spirit brushed against Angharad a heartbeat later and a spear wound erupted into her side, surrendering her soul. She forced herself to continue, to buy passage for the others. Twice she struck at the spirit, now with nothing to lose, first managing a deep slash into the side that parted no flesh, and then an enraged thrust as the spirit's forehead, which parted flesh like a wide, deep slash. Angharad breathed out, shivering for the sudden cold in her veins. Do not let it touch you, not even in passing, she ordered. I love it when you give me orders, Trudiger, Tupac replied, winking at her. She ignored that. The spirit's power was the delay of one wound, Angharad decided. Only while the wound was being delayed, the spirit could give it to one of them instead through contact. A difficult trick to beat if you were unaware of it. Lucky for them, they were not. The spirit was as quick as it had been in her vision, but not quicker than her. Cold burned in her veins, keeping exhaustion at bay, and whatever God had blessed Tupac, it seemed no more inclined to let the Eastleigh be slowed down. Angharad played the bait, slowing until the spirit charged, and only ran when it had begun to move. The creature slid, trying to turn to catch her, and that was enough odd an opening for Tupac to peck at its back. The P34 hazarded a shallow slash as she cut close to the spirit, earning a shallow thrust wound for her trouble, and Tupac's pale gaze fell right on it. The Eastleigh figured it out in a heartbeat, not needing a word. After that, they made sport of their enemy. It moved predictably enough, slowing only to swat with its tail and snapping its mouth whenever they came close, which let Tupac blind an eye, turning into her shallow slash, and even as the spirit roared in anger, Angharad ducked under a tail swing to rise into a smooth pivot. She cut through the side of the tail with a textbook perfect cut, though it only unleashed a pierced hole into the flesh. It was, however, undeniably a third wound. The spirit turned on them in a fury. "You tricked me," it accused. "I did not fall prey to your tricks," Angharad plainly corrected. "Your wrath rings hollow, honored elder." She walked right past the spirit, ignoring Tupac's delighted laugh, and went to claim the prize promised her, a way out of the nightmare. The end. They'd finally got to the end of the maze. Damn the blood-hungry thing. Sweat pouring down her back, Angharad climbed the wide stairs and found she barely begrudged Tupac's presence at her side. He too was a victor twice over. She could return to despising him when he next opened his mouth. The gentle slope ended on flat grounds in the uneven make of nature's hand, the old cavern floor bereft of so much as a speck of life. There were only two things here, a wall of hanging lanterns and a gate. There must have been hundreds of the lanterns, thousands, and though many were of the same cheap iron stock the watch had given them at the old fort, not all were. There was brass and bronze, elaborate silver filigree, and even an exquisite thing of sculpted glass shaped like a flower. The flames were pale and they burned even though not all lanterns had wicker hair. Angharad could not decide which was more unsettling, the unnaturalness of that, or that not all flames burned even. Some were bright, others guttering out. Were there other lanterns gone dark, just out of sight? Shaking herself out of the musings, the P34 moved her eye back to the gate. It had seemed tall from a distance, but from here it was outright colossal. Tall as 36 men, half as broad, and its curved head ended in a great lion's head holding a knocker in its mouth. Angharad looked for a hinge or a keyhole, but all the great panes of bronze displayed was elaborate wrought iron patterns of curving snakes and flowers. "The floor, Tredegar," Tupac said. "Unless you intend on gawping all night?" Angharad duly resumed despising him, as had been foretold. He was not wrong about the floor, however. There were circles of bronze set in it, themselves tracing a greater circle before the gate. 10 circles, to be precise, and that could not be a coincidence. Their slowing gait had allowed the first of the others to catch up, so Lord Zenzel soon let out a sigh as he caught up to her. Would it have killed that fat Tianxi to tell us what precisely was needed to open the gate? He said. "I must confess I am not greatly in the mood for a spot of occult mystery." The watch did tell us. Angharad's gaze slid to the speaker, who she had not expected to come forward on her own. Lan looked as exhausted as she herself felt, but her eyes were sharp. "A bold claim," Zenzel Duma said. "Do elaborate." "They gave us one thing before we set out," the Tianxi said. "You think it's a coincidence they're also hanging off the wall here, Mulaney?" The blue-lipped woman cleared her throat. "Lady Tredegar, would you please place your lantern in one of the circles?" Angharad frowned, but she could see no reason to refuse. Though the blast cloaks had said the lantern touched with their blood was for spirits to find them in the ether, and feed on them should they lose, the golden light of the etheric machine above would prevent such mischief. She walked to the closest bronze circle even as she went through her pack, lightly setting the lantern down in the middle. She stepped back afterwards, wary, but nothing at all happened. 3 heartbeats passed. I thought you'd have taunted me by now, Lan candidly admitted to Zenzel. I thought to wait for Ferrando, so a flame, pale and bright, suddenly lit up inside Angharaide's lantern. That is to say, Lord Zenzel corrected mid-stride. Well done, Lan, capital work. By now the others had caught up, and the method was laid out. Other victors began to set down their own lantern. Isabel was the first after Angharade, and the Perdiri kept her eye on the gate as the Infanzona's lantern lit up. No movement at all. They had precisely 10 victors out of their survivors, so 10 lanterns were set down. Ice Hans was the last, and it was placed within the circle. Angharade idly glimpsed ahead. Slash a flame within the iron, the lion head's mouth opening, the flames winking out and then nothing. Slash. She swallowed her fear. The mirror dancer bared her blade even as the bronze lion head came to life, eyes turning to her. Then the golden light above, their constant companion, went out like a snuffed candle. The barest instant after, so did the hundreds of lanterns on the wall. Angharade had not seen nothing, she realized, but the dark. Shouts of fear and dismay echoed, blades being bared and even a shot fired blindly, or perhaps not so blindly, as the sound of a bullet on metal echoed. Had Shalini snapped a shot? If she had, it did not stop the spirit in the gate, for they all heard something massive landing before them. "Get your lanterns out," Angharade shouted. "Your real ones." It was a madman's whirl after that, everyone scattering as the spirit charged, feeling so much larger than it had as a mere head, even were a matching body attached to it. Angharade glimpsed ahead once, twice. She used not her eyes to guide herself, for she saw nothing, but the pain of being mauled should she misstep. She found the spirit, or close enough, and felt wind as it struck at her but came short. Was it blind to the dark as well? "Here," she shouted. "It is here." A shot flashed through the dark, revealing for a heartbeat the hulking shape of a bronze lion large as a carriage as the bullet went wide. The spirit turned in a moment, striking out, but Angharade threw herself out of the way. Her shoulder landed badly on the stone and she swallowed a hiss as something tore through her. She had just been standing. "I despise cats," Tupac noted in the distance, then raised his voice. "Over here, you rusty old thing." The spirit roared, leaping his way, and Angharade saw it, for some blessed soul had finally gotten a lantern-lit song. Silver Eyes Steady had set her lantern on the ground and was already loading her musket. Tupac, meanwhile, laughed as he danced around swiping claws, and the shots were in such quick succession Angharade almost thought there had only been the one. Instead she saw Shalini drop her fourth pistol with an incredulous look. The Someshwari did not even carry 4. Ice Han had his arms raised to make it easier for his companion to snatch his. The bronze lion roared again, turning, and Angharade saw that enough bullets had landed in his right eye to cave it in. Not that it seemed to slow it down any. "Powder won't work," Lady Ferranda shouted. "Blades out." In the flickering lantern light, they went after the spirit. Tupac and Angharade were quickest in, so they led the dance, darting in and out of the bronze lion's reach. It was slow, the mirror dancer realized, and did not see well. But it struck with the strength of a dozen men, and it was made of fucking bronze. Twice she scored slashes on its face and side, earning only a line, and none of the others did better save for Brun, whose hatchet sunk deep enough into the spirit's head he was not able to wrench it back out. It tossed him away with a swipe of its tail, the Sacramontan falling to the ground with a scream, and others were not far behind. Ferrando was hit by the spirit's shoulder as it ran and went flying as if it had been a battering ram, unconscious on impact. "On me," Angharade hissed at the monster, striking at its sculpted mane. From the corner of her eye she saw land drag away the Infanzona, but it was all spinning out of control. They were losing, could not get past the bronze. "Your contract," Lord Zenzel shouted. "Nair, you need to use your contract." "Fuck," Lord Ishaner cursed, closing his eyes. And a miracle happened, the lion went still. At least until Ishan started screaming. "Kill it," Shalini screamed. "Kill it now or his brain will melt," and Tupac rammed his spear into the lion's dented eye, plunging through bronze until the shaft was a third through. He grunted with effort, tanned muscles clenching as he pushed as far as he could into the creature's head. The lion stilled and Ice-Han stopped screaming. Had they done it? Another 2 heartbeats passed and the lion did not move. It must be dead, Angharade thought, though only Song would be able to confirm that. And where was Song? She had not fought, not even fired the musket Angharade had seen her loading. She could not think the Tianxi a coward, so something must have happened. Was she? Gaze sweeping the cavern to the edge of the light, Angharade found no trace of her. It was only beyond that cast that she glimpsed movement. Song had climbed the wall and hooked a lantern. As Angharade watched a pale, bright flame lit up inside. Ren, what are you doing? Lan called out from below. Your cursed fool! No, Song shouted. Sickle, don't dash! Angharade's gaze went to Tupac, who she found was merely laying a foot on the lion to prepare to rip out his spear. She moved to stop him, trusting in Song, but the Iskli was quicker. The spear came free, and for a heartbeat nothing at all happened. Then the bronze lion moved. It wasn't dead, Angharade realized with horror. Ice-Han's contract only forced it asleep. The Someshwari had been failing in the contest of minds before Tupac's spear went into the skull, which had distracted the spirit enough for the contract to win that contest. Only now the pain of the same spear being ripped out had awoken it. The Iskli went down, slapped away, and Angharade struck at the lion's back. Ice-Han, she screamed, you must. The lion ignored her, the thin scar she inflicted in its back, and bounded forward. Once, twice, and on the third bound its jaw snapped closed. Ice-Han's head popped like a grape, a mess of red and gray that the lion swallowed whole. Shalini let out a heart-rending sound, like her soul had been ripped out, and stabbed at the spirit with a knife. It bounced off the bronze, too blindly struck. Angharade pursued, shouting to draw the monster's attention, and after a final wet gulp it aimed to turn towards her. Zenzel dragged Shalini away, fighting her for every step. Angharade faced the spirit, breathing out, and knew all she had left was. The lantern's arc was perfect, a thing of beauty. The iron box Song had thrown struck the lion on the side of the head, impossibly shattering like glass, and there was a burst of pale light as the flame within flared up. The spirit roared, screamed, but the pale fire spread across its bronze body and blackened the metal. It struggled and twisted, but inch by inch it was devoured by the bright flame until there was nothing left but a blackened husk. And when at last the pale fire guttered out, in the distance the great bronze gate began to open. The sound, Angharade found, could not quite drown out Shalini's sobs. They did not linger. Shalini took up her friend's body, after wrapping it so the lack of head would be hidden, and would not hear of being helped. Beyond the gates lay a hallway, little more than a tunnel sloping upwards. There were no torches here, no light but what they brought with them. Yet Angharade saw that what waited at the end of the hallway was a different kind of darkness from the one behind them, lighter, airier. It was the outside. Sleeping God, Angharade thought, but she was finally going to feel the wind on her face again. She hurried up the stairs, the light of the lanterns trailing behind, until her legs ached and there were no more steps left to climb. Past the edge of the hall waited a long drop, mere feet of ground before the sheer drop of a cliff. And yet Angharade grinned, for above her twinkled the distant stars of firmament. They were out, finally out. Song was the first to join her, musket still at the ready. Together they caught sight of the lights in the distance. Far to the north, past thick woods, where a port was tucked away and waited the ships that would take them away from the dominion of lost things. A cliffside path to their left led that way, snaking down towards the bottom of the mountain and the darkness below. To their right, their west, awaited something better, rest. A fort jutted out of the mountainside, a tower at its summit burning bright and pale. More tempting still were the yellow lanterns around the fort, the marks of sanctuary. Blast cloaks would await them there, Angharade thought, with beds and food and safety before they ventured into the horrors of the trial of weeds. Come on, Song said, brushing their shoulders together. I could do with a good night's sleep after this bastard of a day. So could I, Angharade fervently replied. She glanced back, seeing the others were catching up. They felt it before they heard the noise. the shiver going through the ground, the feeling of something breaking. Then there was that catastrophic, deafening crack as the very earth shook under their feet. Angharad barely stayed on her feet, and caught Song so she would not fall. "Oh gods," the Tiangsi breathed out. Angharad followed the silver gaze, which had come to rest behind them and above their heads. For a heartbeat she understood nothing, and then she saw it too, the crown of the mountain above them had just gone down. The ground shook again, the roar of breaking stone crashing against their ears. The mountain, she realized, was crumpling from the inside, caving in. And as the third great heave threw them both against the ground, the mountain's crown fell all the way down, disappearing from their side. Angharad stayed there gaping until she was shaken out of it. "Dash up, we need to go," someone shouted, dragging her up. She followed, struck dumb, and saw it all fall apart. On the mountainside, chunks of stone began to fall, to roll down the slopes. A landslide, one so large as to defy descriptions. She did not stay long enough to swallow up the watch's mountainside for it. They were already running towards the woods by then, but she heard it. There could be no doubt. Sanctuary lay buried under a cairn of stones, and thus began the trial of weeds. Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.